Hello, everybody. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, that's good. Uh, I'm going to start. We're going to start this conference. If, yeah, because we have quite a lot of people online, and we don't want to be late with the program, which is a packed program. So first of all, let me thank everybody, those actually making their way to Bruegel on a strike day. So it's you're double as welcome as usual. Secondly, I want to thank everybody online for their interest in China. I'm going to spend 2 minutes at most to talk about this project, and then I'll give the floor to Jens Exlund, who is the president of the European Chamber in Beijing. Jens, it's a pleasure to see you already right here online. So what is this all about? This is really a 3-year project. I can't even believe that we finally finished this endeavor. It's been absolutely wonderful to work on China, not only the Chinese economy, which is what we tend to report here at Bruegel, Chinese economy, China, EU relations. This is a much broader project, and you will see that immediately when we start. The title of our consortium, this is a China Horizon project, so financed by the European Commission. I should start by that, it's very important, is dealing with a resurgent China. I can't think of any better way to describe what's going on at the current juncture. We started with a less resurgent China at the beginning of the project, 2022, 2023, as you can imagine, and now we're back to utterly, very resurgent, if I may say, China, which is what we're going to discuss. You will hear not only, again, economy, you will hear social issues, culture, international relations. So it's going to be quite an interesting session, I hope. And this is why I'm going to stop right here. And I'm going to give the floor to Jens to give us some introductory comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thanks to all of you. It has been an absolute pleasure to participate in this program, and as a business person also to have the opportunity to engage with academia. I think it has been very fruitful to get perspectives from different sides of the China debate. I think, Alicia, you are absolutely right that it was the timing was very well chosen in the sense that China did indeed accelerate in many ways. But it was not just a resurging China, it was also a plunging China, you can say, and it goes together. When we look at trade, certainly it has very much been a resurging China. We have seen how China, across many, many industries, have managed to increase its global market share and competing, and very often outcompeting European companies. We have seen how Europe-China trade has completely transformed since the onset of COVID and since the start of this program. And just to give you a few figures, back in 2019, every time Europe exported 1 container to China, China was sending 2.7 containers to Europe. By the end of last year, that has increased to 1 to 4. So every time Europe sends 1 container to China, China is sending the 4 in the other direction. That was the end of last year. Now I checked just 3 weeks ago, and that imbalance has further increased into 1 to 5. When we look at it in terms of global export market share, right before COVID, China accounted for 31.9% of all containers exported globally. By the end of last year, that has increased to 36.2%, and just 3 weeks ago, that stood at 37%. So what we are seeing is not sort of a steady growth. We actually see that China's global share of exports is steadily increasing, and now increasing to the tune of about 1% global share per year. Zooming in on Europe-China specifically, last year we saw that in spite of Europe being a low growth market, increasing in container terms its imports from China by 9%, whereas European exports fell by by 4%. If we look at the first 7 months of this year, we saw the same pattern, that Chinese exports to Europe were up by 9.6%, whereas European exports to China were down by a catastrophic 8%. So these imbalances are not just entrenched, they are actually accelerating. Why is all that happening? It happens primarily because as China came out of COVID, everyone expected that there would be a demand boom in China. That just never happened. The Chinese stopped spending, and they stopped spending because in 2021 we had the crash of real estate, and no one was in the mood to go out and spend money that they didn't have. Because real estate didn't function, we saw a massive reallocation of capital from real estate into manufacturing, and the entirely predictable outcome is that we, across many, many industries, have seen overcapacity. Unfortunately, these dynamics are still at play, and we don't see any imminent change of this sort of deflationary cycle where we now have had for 35 consecutive months producer price factory gate deflation in China. So yes, in trade terms, China is indeed resurging. But when we look at the Chinese economy, you can also talk about a plunge. And when we look at the performance of Chinese companies, we have seen that profitability has steadily decreased. We have seen now, according to China's own statistics, that more than 20% of Chinese companies with revenues in excess of 20 million RMB were actually loss-giving last year. And that number is increasing. And that, of course, goes together with 3 years of deflation and adds to the pressure to export to markets where they can hope for better margins. But Chinese companies are, of course, also winning because they're very good, some of them. But they have also been helped by deflation, and they have been helped by an inexplicable devaluation of the Chinese currency against the euro. China had $1 trillion trade surplus last year and an economy that grew by 5%. Still, the renminbi has depreciated by 10% against the euro since New Year. And that, of course, also helps Chinese exports. So that, of course, raises the question, what needs to get done? Because one thing is for sure, status quo is not an option. We can see already now across many industries that they are at risk. And maybe, sometimes Europe, there are certain things Europe should not be doing, and everyone would benefit from moving to a place where things can be done more efficiently. But we also have to ask ourselves, are there industries now that are vital to Europe for us to be truly autonomous, strong, and prosperous for the future and able to make our own decisions? And I think that must be the next step following this exciting project. That must be take a look at. Given what we learned through the 3 years of this project, given what we know today about how Chinese industrial policy functions, what is it we need to do today to take care of tomorrow? Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Can you hear? Yes. So first of all, thanks so much, Jens. I think you made 2 important points. One on the duality. We'll go back to that of the Chinese economy, exporting more than ever, but not making any money, just being very competitive, but not, in a way, not profitable. I think that's how I would summarize. And then, of course, on EU-China relations, we'll hear more in the second part of this event. Without further ado, we're going to start with what is probably most important, actually, because everything you said hinges on a certain party. And we're going to hear more on that from Kjell-Erik Brøksgaard. Hope I pronounce it correctly. And the title, this is like our first, it's a very important working package of our consortium, which is all about Chinese politics. A lot of what Jens said hinges again on that. And therefore, we're going to have Kjell-Erik chairing, who is the working package leader. If you know about Horizon projects, you know that that's a lot of work. Kjell-Erik, by the way, is also the coordinator of the whole project. So I'm sure that you'll be relieved after this final event. And then we have Jean-François Di Meglio from Asia Center, part of this working package as well, and Niels Grunberg from Merix. So the floor is yours, Kjell-Erik.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you for organizing this. This is terrific. This is a good way of ending our project, our cooperation. It has been a really good journey, really nice 3 years in terms of insight, in terms of discussion, in terms of promoting China research in Europe. I will talk about politics because I'm in the work package on party-state politics. And after me, Jean-François de Meglier will also speak, and Niels Grunberg. But I will start. I think that politics is important when you study China. Politics is in a way, the environment for doing business in China. So what has happened? Well, since the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, state politics has very much evolved around personnel appointments. New people in the Politburo, new people in the Standing Committee, and the transfer of power from government to party. If we look at personnel appointments, there's also been a lot of purges going on. The foreign ministry was purged Xinjiang, the defense minister, now also members of the Central Military Commission, and this anti-corruption campaign, which is behind all these purges, it looks like it will really affect Xi Jinping's power basis, because some of these people who have been purged are actually members of his Fujian faction, which is really behind his power in terms of factional policies. So you see also recently the appointment of Xu Taifeng as head of the organization and department of the Chinese Communist Party. This is one of the most, if not the most important department of the Central Committee, because that's where you have control and management of the nomenclature, the whole appointment system, they control the files, so they have a huge influence on who is heading China at ministerial level in the government, but also across the party. The general secretary, even they have an influence on his files, but also party secretaries in the provinces, and even universities, and also the most important state-owned enterprises in China. But then on an institutional level, you have had this really important shift of power, the transfer of power actually from government to party, the transfer of government functions from the government to the party. And this runs, of course, against Deng Xiaoping's policies during the 80s, during the 90s, where Deng Xiaoping talked about separation of government and party. This is no longer the case in China. It's more about fusion of government and party. So they are really leaving the recommendations of Deng Xiaoping. Also in terms of card management, in terms of age limits, in terms of term limits. Now they even appoint people to the Standing Committee who are 71, 72 years of age. Xi Jinping himself is 72, so he's actually a young man. And since he's a young man, I would also assume that he will be reappointed in 2027 when you have the 21st Party Congress. The meetings of the National People's Congress, while this project has been ongoing, meetings in the spring of 2023, 2024, 2025, really shows that the government, that the state in China has been put under close CCP watch, further really underlining this fusion of party and government. When you look at Chinese documents, I think when you study party politics, party-state politics in China, it's important to study the documents. And when you look at the documents, and a lot of them, then you see a rhetoric, a talk, a narrative about Chinese-style modernization, But this is not about reform, economic reform. It is not about political reform. It's not about further liberalization. It is about focusing on innovation, focusing on research and technology, science and technology, focusing on what Jens called industrial policies. China is really leaving that notion of growing out of the plan. It's no longer about growing out of the plan. It is about industrial policy, the state, the party setting priorities, picking winners. And that is also one of the reasons you see a slowdown in economic growth. The party is shifting its attention to new sectors of the economy. Despite the pressure, you don't really see any successor, any likely successor for Xi Jinping. So that's why I think he will stay on after 2027. And as I said, he will only be 74 years of age, and that is a young man, certainly compared to Trump. But no successor can be identified. I mean, he has deliberately avoided hinting to any successor when he eventually steps down. What is really noticeable also when you look at politics in China today is party building. There's an intense campaign of party building across all sectors of the economy and society, including social policies. And you have this notion in China today of whole process democracy, and this is a notion that covers this very good in social terms, but when you look at state-owned companies, private companies, they're all very much engaged in party building, establishing party cells. Of course, they are in SOEs, but now also they have to be in private companies, in joint ventures, in NGOs, and Chinese companies abroad, they also have to have party cells. Let me mention a few policy recommendations. And I think that it's important for EU officials when they deal with China that they do not only deal with or negotiate with government officials, they also need to have contacts with CCP representatives. I know that many times they are the same, but not always. It's really important if you meet a delegation to figure out who is the party secretary. So also engage with the party. And I said that, as I said, China is moving away from Deng Xiaoping's policies in many ways, and there is actually open criticism of Deng Xiaoping on the part of Xi Jinping and his people. I also think that, in tandem with this focus on science and technology, industrial policies, you see the emergence of a new leadership group in China, a group you could call the aerospace group. Look at the Politburo, you have people like Yuan Jiajun from Chongqing, Ma Xingwei, who is in Xinjiang, and also Jiang Guoqing, the vice premier. They all belong to that aerospace group, a background in aerospace and weapons production. So the current, as I mentioned, the current party building program is really being intensified, and it is the party everywhere. That is sort of the overall picture in all companies, in all sectors of society. The party everywhere. I also believe that our pressure from the West, from the EU, our pressure on China and Xi Jinping and his regime will only bolster his power in China and will only bolster his effort to engage in party building and make China resist foreign pressure. After all, at the end of the day, Chinese politics is really about internal politics. It's about power over the country. It's not about foreign policies primarily. Foreign policy is often being downgraded in the sense that the important positions in the regime, in the power structure, in the power pyramid are occupied by people who've worked in the provinces and who have internal Chinese experiences. And usually the foreign minister is not even a member of the Politburo. The current one is. But usually the foreign minister is not even a member of the Politburo. And that signifies that in China, the most important thing is power over the country. Internal policies take priority. So let me finish by offering this notion of integrated fragmentation. I think that the Chinese bureaucracy is very much fragmented. Various bureaucracies fight for personnel and budget. You also have tension between central and local levels of the state. You have these SOEs developing considerable independence. So you have fragmenting forces in Chinese society, in the economy, in politics, but you also have integrating forces. The system is keeping together, and the integrating forces are, of course, party policies, the party's nomenclature system, the party's monopoly on appointing leaders. So the nomenclature system is keeping the system together. The vast building that Sherman talked about in the 50s in his classic book, Organization and Ideology in China, the house is kept together by these integrating forces, even though you see fragmentation. And it's useful sometimes when you visit China, when you do work on China, to remember that it is quite fragmented. You have these silos of power, but you also have integrating forces. Okay, I think that was, yes.
So I think we move on to Jean-François. Be aware of time because we can't run late from the first panel onwards. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you so much, Kilderic. Just as a reminder, Kilderic has brilliantly led what we call in our language Work Package 3, which is dedicated to looking at domestic policies, and as a representative of Asia Center within this work package in the China Horizons program, was involved as a participant in that work package led by Copenhagen Business School. We have produced specifically an article by the very famous senior researcher Jean-Pierre Cabestan, who's part of our research center based in Hong Kong, a journal article on the whole process democracy. Well, I would just, Kilderic very appropriately alluded to this term, which sounds a bit difficult to understand in our language, but probably easier to understand when we come to explain it, just as Kilderic said. So, of course, it's a slogan. It's a slogan launched by Xi Jinping, but what does it mean? It means that the party, I would say, is only about 100 million people, but the society is much bigger than that, and the whole idea is to, I would say, infiltrate the way of thinking and the vocabulary and the behavior launched by the party, supposedly to have this absorbed by the society reflecting what the party really intends to shape up in terms of Chinese society. But at the end of the day, it tends to lead, and then I rather come to my personal experience rather than the journal article. It leads to our Chinese interlocutors being more and more on a diverging way of thinking, of speaking, of exchanging with us, as used to be the case during the period where exchanges were, I would say, apparently fruitful, going both ways. I'm not saying that there is no exchange. I think we are listened when we speak to our Chinese interlocutors as think tankers, as hosts when we receive representatives from other think tanks. But what we can perceive from their speech is that, yes, this whole process, democracy, has definitely infiltrated every way of speaking, thinking, and interacting with people who are not framed according to this whole process, democracy. So yes, the will to engage, I think, from the West is still there. The way to engage is becoming more and more difficult, be it with the society or be it with representatives or quasi-official members of the Chinese society. So this is the way I would complement your testimony, Kilderic, and I thank you for that.
Wonderful. Have a mic? Yeah. Niels.
Yeah, does it work? Yes. So, as Kilderic said, party building has been a really important part of Xi Jinping's strategy to kind of have the party not only present in our lives here in Europe, but also in China. So I think the look inward, that is something that we've been doing at Merix also to understand how is society impacted by this resurgent Chinese party state project. So what is the project also for society in China? I'll just give you three examples across three different types of areas in society where we really have been seeing a lot of difference over the past 10 years. One is, as Kilderic said, party building in private companies. Then a very intense focus on creating a much tighter knit social governance structure at the local level, at street level, so to fuse public service and surveillance, and in education and nationalism. I think these three are some good areas to see where there has been a lot of party building and a lot of a resurgent party state really in the presence of society. So just to give you a few numbers in the party building in companies, there's been around a dozen of new laws and regulations since Xi Jinping took power on specifically this topic, how companies have to establish party cells. If you, for example, one of the criteria, if you have 3 party members in your company, you need to have a party cell, and so on. So there's very specific rules and guidelines on how a party cell is to be established, who has to establish it, and what it has to do. And this has been a rule for a pretty long time already, but now we really see a lot of effort to guarantee compliance, to make these groups active, to transmit propaganda, new party programs, and so on at the very local level. Mobilization is a really important part of this here. The party members that are active in companies, in NGOs, and all other organizations really that exist in China are supposed to really transmit and to communicate new party efforts. And a new effort, which is interesting, is the market regulator in China is now suggesting that gig workers, so the people who transport food, who bring your packages, they enter deeply into local society. They go into the residential areas, and they are now supposed to also be agents of the party state and transmit propaganda and see if everything is all right. So that this is a suggestion. It's not. I think we don't really see it rolled out, but this is the way we are going. So much more party, much more closely to everyone at the street level. The same goes for the grid management system. I'm not sure if everyone has heard of that. This is an effort to really have a tight-knit social governance system at the street level. I give you an example. The district of Shunyi in Beijing has around 1.3 million residents. There is around 4,500 grids, so it's a physical separation of blocks into grids, and there's around 5,000 grid managers for Shunyi. That makes that gives you, I think, one grid manager per 260 people, and this is the very local person. It's not necessarily a party member, but it's a local representative of the party state, so to say. So, and they do everything from public service to surveillance. Is the car parked right? Does your dog have a license? Is everything in order with the electricity? So very ordinary tasks, very practical. So there's a lot of public service here in this model. But of course, also if there's some elements that are thinking wrong, is there a weird meeting around weird topics, they report and they are integrated with the local police on a digital platform. So really fusing this notion of social service, having the party in there, at the street level, and also having the surveillance part of that in order. I think the last one I would like to mention, and this is a really big unknown to us, the use of education and propaganda in the education system. So you have now, by law, Xi Jinping thought as the backbone, and this is what the law says. Xi Jinping thought as the backbone of education, from kindergarten through high school to university. There's Xi Jinping thought class. There's the party history class, and so on. How does that shape a society? If you have a group of people, a cohort of people, 10 years of education, 15 years of education soon, that is really force-fed with this one vision on society. What does that do to your perception of society, of social order, of the view of what the party is, and how China is supposed to be acting in the global community? I don't think there's an answer yet, but I think we have to think about these questions. What propaganda actually can do if you implement it as thoroughly as China does. And finally, I think these are only 3 examples, but many people underestimate a little bit what the social contract exchange under Xi Jinping is really about, right? It has been fast growth, opportunities, and less politics. It's changing now. There's more politics, lower growth rates, more technology. But really, I think what we see is Xi Jinping is trying to channel his inner Kennedy. I'm sure you're familiar with the quote of Kennedy's at his inaugural address. I think you do not ask what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that's really what Xi Jinping is trying to get everyone in China to think, right? Be a patriotic entrepreneur. Think what kind of technology China needs to get on top in the international race. Be a good party member. So I think reinventing the social contract around public service, technological advance, and a change from patriotism to nationalism is something we cannot oversee under Xi Jinping, and it is something that is really important when we deal with China in the future also.
That was perfect and right on time. Amazing. Thank you so much, Niels. So we are going to move to, I realize that this might be a lot to swallow before offering you time for Q&A, but that's the way we've decided. We're going to go through 3 panels. Bear with us. If you have any clarification question, I repeat, clarification, something really, raise your hand, or those online, but we will try to avoid that to the extent possible because we are really rushing to the second panel. That is basically amazingly interesting. It's culture and society. We hardly talk about that at Bruegel. So it will be a wonderful journey. And Jean-Louis Roca is going to introduce that, and then we have online, Jean-Louis from Sciences Po, Tatiana Fisac online from Madrid, Universidad Autónoma, and then Marcin Jacobi from SWPS, also online, unfortunately. No, sorry. Marcin is in the program, but I think because we have Piotr with us and we love physical presence, we're going to give the floor to Piotr. So sorry for the change in the program, and here you go. You need this for the slides. Thank you so much. Start right away. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay. Yes. This work package is devoted to society and culture. It was really a pleasure to work with my two other institutions. The central idea, to a certain extent, of that type work panel is to work on the opinions of Chinese people. That could be very strange and controversial to a certain extent, because we have the idea to have in every brain of the brain of every Chinese people, you are supposed to have the party talking and not really the person. In fact, we are convinced from the beginning that it's not true, and we try to prove that through research precisely on the expression, the way people are expressing their views, how they are expressing, why they are expressing their views, and how they, of course, try to bypass the system of censorship and sometimes of repression. I would like to focus more today on 2 points. The first one was the findings, and the second one into some recommendations to the EU concerning precisely how to, I would say, deal with the Chinese society to a certain extent. In terms of findings, there is something very interesting as well, that social critique in China covers a very wide range of issues such as working conditions, fierce competition in schools and workplaces, the gender gap, social constraint related to marriage and parenthood, and consumerism as well. And sometimes going beyond this point, for example, we have a controversy about retirement age and the fact that the Chinese government extended the retirement age, and there were a flow of posts and a lot of discussion about that. Of course, after a while we have some censorship, but that couldn't impede people to think, to discuss in private realms, and sometimes in a public field, depending of the situation of people. And in general terms, we measure a growing call for individuals to have more opportunities to make choices in their lives. And it is particularly strong where we are dealing with cultural phenomena like Tangbing, Bailan, Sang, etc., where the young generation are criticizing and opposing to a certain extent, to the norms and values which emerged during the Chinese miracle, as we say, the period of time where, things change a lot in China. Which is very interesting from this point of view, that there is I would say, a parallel evolution of the CCP concerning precisely the right and the possibility to express your own opinion in China. And of course, social media now is playing really a big role from that point of view. It is clear that the Communist Party allows a certain degree of public criticisms in China, mostly on social media, and we try to think about the reasons of that, and of course it's not because CCP leaders become very good boys and girls sometimes, but because there is really substantive reasons to that new perception, as we say. Because it is important for the party to identify problems early on and act swiftly and preventively. We have just talked about the control at grassroots level, but precisely it's very important to know about that, what is going on in the mind of people at grassroots level. And of course, to address in advance, to a certain extent, people's anger and worries. And the importance of social media is really directly can be directly explained by the needs of central government, first to gain a better understanding of public opinion, but also to better understand what is going on in different local governments. And here also there is a connection with what you said about precisely the link, which is a very central question, I think, between local governments and the central governments. The consequence of this kind of convergence, to a certain extent, maybe it's a little bit controversial to say that, is that the Chinese society has gained spaces of autonomy of expression, I will say, to a certain extent. They can have a life outside the party to a certain extent in many aspects, of their life. For example, marriage, babies, work, etc., etc. Politics. Of course, the question which is emerging when we are talking like that is the question of politics. According to us, which is very important, that all these new waves of criticisms and expression does not necessarily entail wishes for regime change. Many people are very critical, but at the same time support the party. And many people have double standards to a certain extent. They have always talking differently when they talk in a public audience, for example, or when they talk with their friends, their family, or they talk with their colleagues, etc. And I think every researcher doing research in China can recognize very easily that, that the discourse, these people can defend, front of you is completely different from the discourse they would have with an official or in a meeting, And why finally the political scene is not really addressed by this movement, as we say, in the society. One of the reasons, of course, is the fear of repression and suppression. But we know everywhere it's like that. And we have revolution as well. But sometimes. Then it's probably one of reason, but probably as well the most important element from this point of view with the fact that to be dissidents in China is not really attractive. Why? Because it's not useful, as we say, to a certain extent. Because it's a sort of a social death, and you have no longer influence. You have no longer possibility to express yourself. And for the vast majority of people, it's better to restrain to have criticism in the public field, as we say. And the party itself know that very, very well. And the last reason for that, I think, is a lack of alternative. Representative democracy is not really attractive for the time being in China. For different reasons, you can imagine yourself with the election of different kinds of personality, as we say. But freedom of speech and association, yes. That's really a cleavage between the two. Very different attitude between the two. Election, no, to a certain extent, roughly speaking, of course. But, of course, freedom of speech and association, of course, is very, very, very advocated by the Chinese people. To sum up this point, I would say that it's a little bit like in France, that a lot of people are criticizing our president, but very few people would like to overthrow the democratic system. Yeah, to criticize the government and to overthrow the regime is two very, very different things. To finish, some, I would say, recommendation to the EU, and it's very linked to what the policy brief we have recently written with the Polish team. Systematic anti-CCP press coverage and anti-CCP political attitudes, first of all, do not create a good environment for Chinese migrants in Europe. That's also a reality that we have a lot of Chinese origin people, etc., etc. And sometimes there is a sort of, mixing people, Chinese, what is going on in China, and the situation of Chinese people living in Europe, and do not facilitate beneficial relations between the EU and the PRC. I would say every anti-CCP discourse lead to a sort of a reaction among the society, even among the people who are criticizing the party, saying that, it's not really fair to do that way. Secondly, rather than focusing on political or cultural differences, we think that the EU should focus on common traits and problems. Third, it is important to take into account the double identities of many Chinese people, including scholars and officials, so double standards. And to consider that it is normal for a Chinese person, and sometimes just to be able to survive, to have these double standards when they express their opinions. And finally, not to require them to choose between being dissidents or supporters of the CCP, because the vast majority of scholars, of people, of professionals, etc., are both, to a certain extent, dissidents, I will say, but at the same time, supporters. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we move to Tatiana. Tatiana, maybe we can, we take off the slides and so that we can see Tatiana. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Alicia. Well, for the past 3 years, working with different members of this consortium, I've noticed that universities and think tanks often look at China in very different ways. Think tanks tend to focus on the risks and threats that China poses to the European Union, while universities aim for a deeper understanding and better dialogue with China. And in my view, we can only gain some insights about China by looking beyond the near present. Now, I would like to focus on some ideas about how we can improve dialogue between China and the EU. And for that, we need a historical perspective. I would say that on one side, we know that China is an ancient civilization, but we forget that many of its past cultural patterns are still very much alive today. On the other side, sometimes we forget that European communication is also rooted in practices dating back to ancient times. Let's, for example, remember Athens' rhetorical practices at the beginning of democracy in Europe in the 5th century before Christ. At that time, in Athens, those aspiring to high political military office require oratorical skills to persuade their audience. The rhetorical practice was essentially a monologue with a top-down dynamic. The one speaking was wishing to gain or maintain power, and no political deliberation on the pros and cons of the issue was introduced. Rather, the objective was to gain and secure the audience's trust in the speaker. In China, this has never been the case. In imperial times, the use of rhetorical speech was often in private dialogue among equals or directed from a lower position to someone with higher authority. And this is how direct speech became the norm in Europe, while in China, indirect speech was the norm. And that continues to be the case. In China, direct speech is often seen as brusque or even impolite. And this has nothing to do with the current one-party political system. The fact is that many statements made by European leaders in meetings with Chinese representatives are aimed more at public and domestic audiences rather than at a genuine dialogue. Open accusations are ineffective with Chinese political elites and only increase nationalism among the broader population, as Jean-Claude has just pointed out. To strengthen communication between Europeans and Chinese, policymakers should prioritize building long-term trust through private, carefully prepared exchange rather than public confrontation. Sensitive matters, such as, for example, human rights, should be addressed in confidential spaces where open dialogue can occur away from public scrutiny. It is essential to foster a deeper mutual understanding of each other's traditions and modes of communications, as well as to maintain a willingness to engage in dialogue free of prejudices. This and many other problems are analyzed in my policy brief entitled China as Intercultural Partner, Obstacles to EU Effective Communication. Well, I also address other problems like the problem of translation and interpretation. And let me just underline one point. I believe that the EU must invest more effort in training skilled Chinese interpreters and translators of European origin, serving both EU institutions and individual member states. I don't believe that AI will really replace these people, and we need them for creating this climate of dialogue with China. Well, I could say many other things, but I've stopped here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tatiana. We move to Piotr.
Everyone. I would like to briefly reflect on our research made by SWPS University along with French and Spanish colleagues. During our exchanges with academics, policymakers, analytical circles, we reached an overall agreement that culture is important. And there are at least few reasons to follow that intuition. First, Chinese cultural sector, even if centrally governed, is very highly competitive. And this high competitiveness may not only leave some prominent imprint on China's economic performance, but it also results in some cultural phenomena that may be under analytical radar. So things that many millions of people around the world, including young Europeans, teenagers, young adults, absorb and consume via social media, they are a part of cultural phenomena that started in China, in fact. So we have that image of China as a country that does not have a soft power, and this is changing, and this is something that we should look at. Another reason that we could think of is that social research is becoming more and more challenging in China, both social research and anthropological research. So looking at cultural productions provides those missing links and missing insights. And we, as WPS University, have been given a chance to do something new, to take some new approach. But the challenge is twofold: how to turn culture into policy recommendations, that's one thing, and how to make those insights a part of wider EU agenda. So the first task, outlined already by Jean-Louis, we performed a kind of mapping, looking at different social phenomena as they are shown in wide body of cultural productions, be it films, movies, books, theater plays, visual arts, and they provide a kind of deep knowledge about the things that are happening in China, and we are well aware of: precarity, marriage, divorce, hesitance to marry, hesitance to have children, and feeling of irrelevance that many young people feel. And we strongly believe that this deep knowledge should inform policies, and that we should keep observing those as a part of EU community of researchers and experts. And we should engage in cultural exchange, as those double identities have already been mentioned. So engagement with Chinese representatives, Chinese artists, is a chance to see a different China. And there might be a preconception that artist is someone privileged or representing only a specific social setting. But during our research, we have seen tremendous things, very informative things produced by Foxconn workers, produced by low-rung society, artists, poets, and this is something that can deeply inform our seeing in China as country is becoming, well, more isolated, so to say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. So I think one thing to reflect upon before we start the third panel, and you kind of breathe for a second, we will give you a second. I think the beauty about this consortium, if I can reflect on it for a second, is that, you know, it's really so diverse in opinions, in experiences, and we still manage to produce all of this research. So, you know, I was reflecting on it while I was listening, and I'm very happy with it. So it is my turn now. We're going to move to the economy. I took a good note of Tatiana's point that we think tanks are really very much on the risk side of things. I just want to reflect on the fact that this was not the case before. So in other words, many years ago when I started studying the Chinese economy, it was all about opportunities. Maybe we looked much more like universities at the time. And the question is it us who changed, or is it China who changed? And I'm going to argue, is it China who changed? And, you know, you can disagree, and it's great to have a discussion on this, but that's kind of my, you know, starting point on why maybe there is so much divergence. And I'm going to focus on the economy here. So what really changed was that China, you know, once upon a time was seen, obviously, as a massive market for the world, growing market, growing imports, especially since 2008, not only when China entered the WTO, but beyond, opportunities for emerging markets, for Europe, you name it. China was also a big recipient of FDI, so, you know, our companies were very keen. We had Jens there kind of confirming that, very keen to move to China, either to process trade or to produce for that market. That was China 20, even 10 years ago, I would say. So what happened since? I would say that part of what happened is really, you know, how would I say, it's China to be, I would say it's China to be commended. Yeah, China moved up the ladder through hard work, things that we should all be commending in the very same. But other things also happened, and some of which hurt directly or indirectly both the European economy and European companies. And that's what, you know, we're going to expand for a better word. So the title of this really is about fading El Dorado. So I actually would argue that if we had to change this title today, we would basically turn it into, yes, China was El Dorado for European companies, for European exporters. That El Dorado is fading. I wouldn't change that title. But I would add that it is also because of a dual nature of the Chinese economy. And let me explain what I mean by that dual nature. So on the one hand, China is importing less. We heard from Jens that our exports are falling around 8% for an economy that is growing 5%. So you explain me how that can be possible. But I can tell you how it can be possible. It's because you could argue we're less competitive. You can work, well, some of that competitiveness is measured by a flat RMB against the dollar. We are appreciating massively. Chinese export prices falling, not falling. The biggest fall was mid-2024, just to give you a sense, 10%. Not even Japan in the 90s had export prices falling at 10%. So that massive competition through shrinking margins, you know, pushing prices further down is something that, you know, Chinese call involution. We could talk about that, but the point is it does hurt competitors, and Europeans, so happens, we are large exporters, as China is, and that hurts the European economy. The other thing that is happening is that these imports are falling also because China is substituting imports, localization, you can call it force or not force, induced localization. That's also part of the reason, because, you know, companies producing in China, especially our companies, need to, you know, cut on their own imports of goods and services, especially goods. And that has an impact on our exports to China. So, you know, all of these things are very different from what it was when El Dorado was there. And this is policies. This is not coincidental. These are policies that China is conducting. On the other hand, this is the duality of the Chinese economy. China is rising in terms of value added of exports, technological content, patents, scientific publications, you name it. And this has to be acknowledged. It's wonderful for China, but, you know, this is a relative game. It's less wonderful for others. And nobody's blaming China. It's just saying this is a fact. So what this really means is that as China moves up the ladder, the type of dependencies that we used to remember, and I'm talking only COVID, if you think about it, which could be simple things that anybody can reproduce if you really want to, you know, whether it's mask or... No, we're moving to rare earth, which we can't reproduce. So, you know, that's the level of dependencies. So it's not so much about whether you're dependent, it's about what you're dependent on. Can you reproduce it? And as China moves up the ladder, what you are dependent on are things that you can't reproduce, that you depend on Chinese patents, as of now, soon, possibly subject to export controls, at least those on rare earth refining. So, you know, you start realizing that it's not so much about relative innovation trends, it's also about critical dependencies that we're talking about here. So that's why that duality of the Chinese economy becomes, you know, quite a lose for us. And it's, again, it's not China trying to do this. I'm not claiming that. I'm just stating a fact. If I end with a project that will be maybe revised later on EU-China, but I want to say that if we also look at European companies in China, and Zhang Weishu will comment on that, also from Google, you'll see also that because of this reality, our companies also operating in China are having major issues. Their sentiment is going down, their profits are going down. So, you know, it's a big chunk of what we see. So if I move on to the next slide, and very quickly, as if this were not enough, we're in the midst of a major strategic competition between the US and China, probably bigger than ever. And what we know is that I call it a sandwich situation. You can use whatever expression you want, but that's where we are, because we can't anymore rely on, okay, the US will take care of this. And that is why I think our strategic thinking about what to do about this is extremely important. We'll hear more on the working package 6, which is European China. I finished by saying this is the next slide. I don't know whether maybe I get the pointer or somebody can move it around, make it, because I do want to show. It's not there, never mind. The good thing is you'll probably have some leaflets, and if you don't find the leaflets outside, which I'm not sure, you can remember these 3 words: China Economic Database. This is something we did for the project. Some of the contributors are there. It took us quite a while to come up with over 200 series of data, some of which proprietary data, such as if you want to know how is sentiment in China, consumption sentiment, investment sentiment, all of that is there. I want to really recognize the work of my colleagues there. It's been a big project. And the good news is that although this project is over, that data set will be taken care of by Bruegel, so you will continue to see updates, monthly updates of this database. So thank you so much for your time. I leave the floor to Alex. Yeah.
Hello. Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alexander Brown. I'm a senior analyst at Merix in the economy and industry team. And over the past few years, we've also been able to look into many of the areas that Alicia has referred to with the support of the DWARC project, so it's been a great pleasure to be involved. I want to raise 3 points really looking at how China is approaching industrial policy, and then another 2 looking at how that's impacting the EU's dependencies on China. My first would be, I think it's clear that China really feels vindicated in the approach that it's taken in pushing more self-reliance and securitizing supply chains. Self-reliance has always been part of China's sort of policy agenda going back to Mao. It's been an important objective. But when we think back to 10 years ago when the Made in China 2025 plan was launched, it was really more about moving up the value chain. This changed in 2018 when Huawei was targeted by the United States, and then the focus really shifted to securitization. And since then, we've seen since Trump, the first Trump administration, continuing under Biden and then Trump again, a lot of pressure on China from the United States in terms of tech and trade restrictions. And China's been very successful in managing this. So it's pursued an aggressive import substitution agenda that's come at a cost to its own economic growth, and it's hit productivity growth in China. But I think, as we see what's emerging in recent weeks, this is really paying off for them now, where they're in a position in certain industries where they feel like they also have really strong leverage. So I think that underlies the fact that China feels like it's on the right track, and no one should be should assume that they're going to deviate and abandon this heavy industrial policy focused model, even though they are facing a lot of critical challenges with their economy. They're going to keep focusing on industrial policy and innovation, and that will be confirmed next year when they release their next 5-year plan. So the direction of travel is already very clear. I think the second point I'd like to make is if we go back to the Made in China 2025 plan and look at the original aims that it had in terms of moving up the value chain and try to assess, how did they go there? Well, broadly, across the board, they were very successful. 10 years ago, a middle-class Chinese person, they might have had a Volkswagen car in their car park. They might have been using an Apple iPhone. That would be what they're aspiring to do. Today, that would be a BYD and a Huawei. So really, they've been able to tackle many strategic sectors. Over 2/3 of cars sold in China today are Chinese brands. That's been an industry where they've been hoping to make advances for decades, and they've been able to pull it off. So they're making clear advances in the domestic market, and if we look more broadly in the global market, well, then they also have areas where Chinese companies are succeeding. In terms of solar panels, 80% of that market is provided by Chinese firms, wind turbines, 60%, and I think we're going to see this occur in more and more industries. As Alicia was pointing out too, they've invested a lot in their innovation and R&D capacities, and that hasn't paid off just yet in some sectors. But when you look at areas like biotechnology, robotics, medtech, semiconductors, they've laid a foundation there. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see increasing competition with China. So it's really important for EU firms, which are still, I would argue, are quite optimistic or confident about their ability to stay ahead. And the common strategy that we hear is that they have to run faster, they have to continue to invest in innovation. Well, I just say watch out, because China's really coming fast, so they need to be especially vigilant. And maybe going back to this El Dorado analogy, yes, China was absolutely an El Dorado, and it might still be in certain sectors, because advanced European companies can still make good offerings in some areas, but it's quickly turning into an economic storm in many other areas. So we're going from an El Dorado to an economic tornado of sorts, which brings me to my next point, which is really about overcapacity. And here I think it's the important point to make is that overcapacity is really systemic in China. It's not a bug, but really a feature. And as far as the leadership in China goes, they consider this as an acceptable cost in terms of their policy playbook to make advances in certain industries. So they may send out clear signals which encourage all local governments to invest in certain strategic sectors, and that will lead to waste. But if that leads to the situation where all these companies are competing against each other and becoming more efficient, creating this state-sponsored competition, which really makes China the place to be if you want to be a leader in these sectors, that's to China's ultimate advantage, and that will start to spill over to foreign markets as well. How should the EU deal with this problem? I think it's clear you have to implement the measures that you have at your disposal at home first, but you should also be working as much as possible with partners. And I know that's a very difficult thing to put into implementation, but I think the main point here would be to say, do what you can where you see opportunities. Engage in free trade deals with other countries. Try and find synergies. Maybe a country like Indonesia, they're not so worried about their auto sector, so they're willing to open up their auto sector to Europe, and we can accept more of their products in return. So we need to find ways that we can cooperate with other countries to reach our goal and build a critical mass, because the EU is an exceptionally important market in many sectors, but the more countries that we can build a coalition with, the more effective our pushback against China will be. 2 points on the dependencies, which are really growing stronger, more and more apparent in the EU-China relationship. At Merix, we've developed a database, a trade dependency database, which looks at over 5,000 product categories, and we track the evolution of import dependencies based on HS6 codes. And what's pretty remarkable, if we look at how things have changed from the year 2000 to 2022, the number of product categories where the EU relied heavily on imports from China has roughly tripled to reach 421 categories. So that's almost 10%. On the other hand, China has roughly halved the number of products for which it relies on the EU for. It's gone down from 235 to 120. So this is really another way of looking at the shift in the trade relation dynamics, and it's clear that we need to be paying more attention to the emergence. We need to monitor these trade dependencies and focus on the areas where we think it's most critical to address them. The final point would be export controls, and how China has made it very clear that they're willing to use these now to target entire sectors and value chains. And I think it's interesting that Europe was not the primary target, at least this year when they first rolled this out in April. It seemed to be more focused on the US, but the EU has very much been collateral damage, and we've seen how they've been very willing to leverage this to try to coerce the EU to abandon their restrictions on their tariffs on EVs. So the Chinese position is extremely clear here, and just last week they've expanded their export controls on rare earths. I think here it's essential that we use this moment now to really build momentum also between member states for more forceful action to address these dependencies. If we don't address them, China will always use them to coerce us, and we're just going to be in that terrible situation. It won't be easy, but we have to do our best to address this. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks so much for going through all of the points. I realize I didn't cover half of what I had there, but it's good because this means we are early for to give you the floor finally, because you've been very patient. So I'm going to invite Tim Röhlig to basically comment on everything you heard. Tim Röhlig is a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, and I didn't cover R&B, lots of things you could ask, but I just wanted to give the floor. There's too many people sitting probably with wonderful questions, so why listen to us any longer? Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alicia. Well, I realize I'm the only one and last one to stand between your questions and the panel, so I'll really keep it brief. But a few caveats to start with. First of all, congratulations to the group as it sits here to the researchers online in the room or at home for a really fantastic work in this Horizon project that I understand comes to an end now, which I think is a real loss for Europe that this runs out, but I hope that there will be some form of continuation. So it gives me some hope in a way, this Horizon, because it showcases the knowledge on China that exists in Europe. We very often mourn, and I think rightly so, that we don't have enough knowledge, but it's also good to have a moment to sort of realize what we do have. There's also a bit of a discouraging fact when I hear, just in one of the presentations, that the gap between universities and think tanks may have not been bridged by this Horizon, so it seems that we have to do even more on that, because I still would say that deeply understanding China and understanding the risks or highlighting the current risks should not exclude each other, so I think that's not mutually exclusive. Second, I mean, you've given me a very easy task to comment on the political development, the society development, and the economic development. I mean, it's super easy to do. I could already see how you are grappling in each of the 3 panels with covering everything. So you want me to comment on this in 5 minutes. So let me say this. What I find quite striking, interesting, I mean, you have very diverse perspectives on this, so I don't try to sort of synthesize in a way to say you have all one message. You certainly don't. But what I find sort of interesting, my reading of what you do here is that we in Europe, and I think understandably so, tend to emphasize sort of the growing self-confidence of China. And of course, if you compare to China's position in global affairs 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, China has been growing much more influential. The Chinese know this, and they have grown more self-confident. So it's perfectly understandable that our prism through which we look at China is one where we see a confident, strong China. At the same time, when going through these presentations, I feel, and I think one of you rightly said that just like in any other country, I think foreign policies are first and foremost informed by domestic developments and domestic priorities. In that way, China's just a normal country. I mean, it's the same for all of our European countries. We tend to sort of first see how do we create employment, or how do we solve the migration crisis, or whatever the political priority is, but very often it really comes sort of from domestic concerns. And same is for China. And China internally, when I sort of listen to you, seems to be not so self-confident. And I'll quickly sort of run through what you say. What you said here. So on the political layer, the omnipresence of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the party has always been the gravitational center of force, has always been the ultimate power in this country. What has really changed, and I think your work and your presentations today illustrate this really well, is that we see a centralization of power, and that we see that also CCP power becomes more visible, more tangible, also for the people. And that, in a way, I feel is more of a crisis mode, because of course the decisions have ultimately been taken by the CCP before, but by taking a back seat, the party could also always blame, in a way, the state institutions if something went wrong in the past. Now it can sort of, it can sort of revert to that crisis mode. In a way, it has made the previous crisis mode a permanent fact. I come to the society level. I mean, I think it's very good to sort of acknowledge the nuance that the society is not demanding regime change. Of course, that would be far-fetched to say, but there is criticism, there is discontent, and adding sort of from the conversations I'm having in Beijing, I think the party is well aware of that. So the fact that the rooms for dissent, even if partial dissent, are closing. They still exist, and we tend to overlook where they are in Europe. That's true, but there is dissent. That is really also bothering and concerning the party, and the fact that these rooms close has also is for a reason. Finally, on the economic side, yes, economic self-reliance. I mean, you outline sort of the darker trajectory in terms of growth potential, attractiveness. China is really more moving to a question of economic resilience, of self-reliance. So also trying to sort of rather make itself shock-proof, crisis-proof, and in that way, I think that is also quite telling. Now, I promised to be short, so I'll only say one sentence about sort of the EU, because inherently, of course, you also said the EU could learn something from it, and certainly it does. And to me, I think I'd say it needs to adapt in two ways. It needs to find, it needs to, of course, prepare to this new reality of China, what China is, how internal vulnerabilities and growing self-confidence in the international sphere are informing it, and how we need to sort of, the EU term, I guess, is de-risk from it, so the risk inherent to that. But I think there can also be a second layer of sort of thinking a bit about how to strategically engage with China. And engage for long seemed to be equated with cooperation. We are on the same page, we have common interests, but maybe strategically engaging rather sort of means understanding vulnerabilities, understanding pressure points, understanding that China has sort of become a bit more transactional, and how we can also be transactional, understanding where China relies on us, what China's interests are, how they are important for us, and how we can strategically engage with them on a political layer, on an economic layer, certainly, and I guess indeed overlooked sometimes quite a bit also on the society layer. All right. I'll leave it here and look into the room to see whether you have any questions. I do see there's one online, but maybe someone in the room wants to break.
Sorry, just a short
Yes.
announcement for those online. We have Slido.com. Password is China, capital C. Please send your questions across, and maybe we can show the... Is it not on? Yeah, sorry. So we can maybe even see the questions here. Yeah, that would be great. So we start with the floor, and Tim, sorry, we invited you for comments and moderation on the Q&A, and you can then throw the questions to us. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone in the room? Nobody wants to break the ice? Well, then I think we go to the first. Oh, there. Fantastic. If you could maybe briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Solange Châtelard, and I'm a researcher at ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles. So my question really sort of shifts the emphasis from China to Europe, and I'm really interested in what Europe is essentially doing about this new reality, because it sort of seems like we're increasingly living in China's world. We're just not really acknowledging it yet. So the question is, there are obvious internal and external challenges, to dealing with China, but what would the sort of ideal, optimal international climate be for us to handle China strategically and engage with it in the way that we would like to, with that power, with that autonomy, with that ambition? So what would the sort of ideal external international climate be, and what are the main obstacles that we need to focus on to get across, to get over, to get there internally within Europe?
Well, I have the privilege to pass all the difficult and pressing questions to the panelists. That's the beauty of being the moderator. Anyone who wants to take this one, otherwise I'll call out someone. Okay, Alicia, thanks.
I'm going to start, but Tim, feel free to add if you want, So it's such a difficult question, Solange, but we also have later, EU-China relations, you'll hear more. I happen to have been writing, actually, we wrote, I should say, in the past, brief with Abigail, who I think just left, unfortunately, who went back to the external action, European external action, which means that hopefully she can apply part of what we recommended there. And I think the key word there was coexistence. I want to use that word. Because I think, we can talk, that doesn't mean we shouldn't engage or, of course we should have a dialogue. I mean, but this is obvious, but beyond the obvious, the question is how close maybe I would put it this way, how close you want to get, I'm talking about the economy here, okay? If you want to be aware, or if you want to get close because you want to make business, that is clear. But you also want to be careful that you don't create asymmetric dependencies, which is what I was trying to, and I think we both went through that. So no, you get close, but you don't want to get burned. Yeah, this is kind of so that's why I call it coexistence, because coexistence doesn't mean you never look at each other. It means you coexist, but you're careful with that coexistence because there are certain things that might hurt you. So I think we need to be ready, but also be picky on, where we fully collaborate. We could talk about research and in critical technologies. We should, and in a way, frankly speaking, I do think that's what China is doing. It shouldn't surprise anybody, because this is not us doing this and China, engaging with open arms, panda hugging. I don't think that's where we are. So, and the export controls are the best example of this. We could have heard this doesn't apply to European companies. No, we didn't hear that, and we know it's extraterritorial, and we know that it's going to affect even, greenfield investment, Chinese investment into Europe, which we are all kind of aiming at. So, because of that, I think we need to find ways to coexist, but being careful about certain things that we may be losing, and being quite open to things that appeal, and I'm not going to say our values, you can put that if you want, our interests. So that would be my response. I don't know if anybody wants to add. Yeah.
Okay, well, since you sort of invited me to compliment, let me maybe just add one thought here. I think a major problem in the bilateral relations between the EU and China, to me, is that there's an asymmetry in what we want from one another. We want China to do stuff. China is quite happy with the status quo. So if anything, China wants to maintain the status quo. And we are entering sort of a more competitive game with the Chinese, and therefore, to be credible in a competitive game, I think you have to be ready to leverage that status quo and sort of say, this is not a given. It's the default option can't be that we just stick with the status quo. And right now, I think the EU as a whole, in all its complexity of all the EU institutions, is not ready enough. At least that's, I think, Beijing's perspective. Beijing is not expecting the status quo to change. It feels that there's too many actors, powerful actors in the EU that stick to the status quo, and thereby you can sort of credibly leverage the threat of closure in a way. That is not to say we should not engage, but the problem is it's quite asymmetrical in my view. I do like the first question as well that is online, which is essentially sort of what can we learn from the Chinese? I mean, we have very different political and economic systems. I think we both sort of face, and that's reflected in the question as well, that we can't fully decouple from one another. So the question a bit sort of what can we learn, how can we engage? I think it's also related, which is why I'd like to bring it on. I think that Alicia certainly is well placed because there is this reference to the industrial element of it. But I would also be interested in sort of the political interactions. Is there something that we can learn? And since we've heard from you, maybe I could ask one of those who've covered sort of more the political side of the story. Is there something we can learn from Chinese diplomacy?
I'm not sure about that. I think it's important to study the political system in China in order to interact with China, to understand, how policies are made and according to what considerations and who is making the decisions and how does the system interact at various levels. I mean, we see these decisions, policy decisions. Now soon there will be a 15 five-year plan. But what goes into the process, how is it made, and so on, and that is something we need to study in order to understand what is going on. But I'm not sure we can sort of learn something from the arrangement of the political system as such in China. It's highly centralized. I mean, would we like that? I mean, they talk about whole process democracy now, consultations at all levels, but this is consultation directed by the Chinese Communist Party. There's a reluctance to vote, because if you vote, then you don't consult, and probably most of the decisions in the Politburo, certainly the Standing Committee, are made on a consultant's basis. I mean, they don't vote, they consult, and if they don't agree, then they have a new meeting. It used to be like that. I'm not quite sure it always is like that under Xi Jinping, because we know that he has really centralized a lot of the decision-making in the party, that he is himself interviewing candidates to the Politburo, he's interviewing even candidates to the Central Committee, and all members of the 24-member Politburo, they have to refer directly to Xi Jinping and not members of the Standing Committee, which was the case in the past. By the way, you said something about the political system.
Derek,
yeah.
Closer, because closer to the mic.
Okay. Tim, you said that the party has always been there. That's true, but it's there, in a different way. I mean, during Mao's time, the party was almost destroyed. Mao almost destroyed the party during the Cultural Revolution. He was really against bureaucracy. He was against rule, regulations, and so on. Under Xi Jinping, you have the revival of the party bureaucracy. He's resting his power on the party. And this is why Zheng Yongyan calls him the organizational emperor. But Xi Jinping is, he's working in an environment where you have institutions. He's meeting with, the Central Committee. Now they have a meeting here on the 20th of October. He meets with the Politburo, every second month. He meets, with the Standing Committee every week. It's not like Putin. He sits, at a long table, not really interacting with his people and the institutions. There are institutions in China. It's highly centralized, but there are institutions. So the party has strengthened its role. It's more centralized. The party is always there, but not to the extent it's there now, at all levels, also at the local level at NIS.
Yeah, I mean, directly to that, I mean, there is a time between Mao and Xi, and I think the party has been rebuilt before. But I mean, I'm not questioning. I think we're on the same page on that. I mean, it has, the way that the party operates and controlled and is visible has, of course, changed dramatically also from the direct predecessor of Xi Jinping, from Wu, from Deng, etc. I think we have Tatiana who wanted to come in on that question as well. So, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I just wanted to add that I think we can learn a lot from China, but we can learn from the good and from the bad part. And for me, the good part is that China has alleviate poverty in the last years in a way that nobody has done before. And I think that's good, and we have to understand that that's a progress. On the other side, China has decided to go for technology. And I am really very afraid of the fact that in Europe, we also consider that progress means implementation of technology. And I don't think that's progress, because if we have a look at the Chinese society and how they are controlled by technology and how we are controlled by technology nowadays, maybe we could have a look at what's going on in China. They are in advance with the implementation of technologies and new technologies. And maybe we can have a look and decide by ourselves what we want and what we don't want. And in that sense, I feel that the Commission, the European Commission, don't have a very clear idea about the impact of technology in every day, even for work and for normal people at home. And I think we should have a look at China and try to avoid many mistakes that will come if we don't really learn from that. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm looking again into the room whether there's any questions. Yes. So you first, and then maybe we take, I don't know, how much time do we have? We stop at, we have time. Okay, then we go one by one. We start with you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jan Nusser. I'm a student and also a trainee at the representation of Baden-Württemberg. And my question is regarding like the relations to China. I was realizing that oftentimes when we're speaking about economy, defense, or also like diplomacy, depending like the United States, that there was like a drastic change of relations to them. And most of the times, if that's this issue is called out, it's also that not only the US is mentioned, but also like China. And my question is, are like the relations to China dramatically changing like to the US, or is it more that, for example, the position of China changed through the times because they got more like to a more powerful situation, and that this leads to another relations between the EU and China?
All right, so the question being of continuity. Maybe we take a few indeed, because we have a few online. So I saw this one, and here I can't watch. Okay, yes, you go, and then we have Laura.
Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Konrad Schatters. I'm a China analyst at AMO, Association for International Affairs, and the project China Observers in Central Eastern Europe, so CHOICE. And I have one question, perhaps to any of the speakers that would like to answer it. Because one of you mentioned the EU's need to cooperate on bilateral deals and building certain alliances, for example, with Indonesia, that would allow to push China back a bit more prominently. But China is simultaneously and very actively seeking its own bilateral deals and alliances as well, and very frequently with the same countries, for example, of the global south. So in your opinion, very briefly, what edge does the EU have with all of its complexity, its divisions, its conditionality? What edge does the EU have over China while talking and dealing with these countries?
Next is Laura.
Hello, my name is Laura. I'm a trainee for the Indo-Pacific at the EU Institute for Security Studies. And I'm wondering, since it was mentioned that in China, like in other countries, domestic policy informs foreign policy, and it was also mentioned that dealing with Chinese officials is not always easy, cooperation, trust is not there. So I'm wondering if the EU has any channels or leverage into Chinese society to change the domestic situation. If not economic, then what kind of means? Thank you.
All right, do I miss anyone in the room? No? All right. Oh, yeah, sorry. Two more. I missed two.
Thank you. I am just surprised and maybe late or in advance. We speak of what EU should understand, what she could learn, but after all, and what we want, but what does China really expect from us? That I am anxious to hear it.
And the lady in the red down there.
Hi, hello, I'm Emma Belmonte, also with CHOICE and AMO, like Conrad here. I have a reaction to something that was said about having dialogue with China away from public scrutiny, because that would accommodate better to what China's way of doing dialogue. In light of certain recent events, though, how do we reconcile that with an obvious need for transparency and accountability when it comes to dialogue with China? Thank you.
Fantastic. I think we have quite a number of questions. Should we maybe go in the order of the panels and sort of see what does the group on politics have to say? I mean, just pick and choose. I don't think everyone can answer all the questions. Please, maybe?
I think we can start with Alex because you
Okay.
raised your hand.
Yeah, sure. So the first, thanks a lot for the questions. The first one was what accounts for the change in EU-China relations, I think, and how that relates to the United States, whether it's on the same level. From my perspective, there's really two key issues which have led to a major shift. The first one is economic. So the relationship has really gone from one that's complementary between Europe and China, where Europe has really benefited a lot from trade and investment in China, to one which is increasingly shaped around competition. And the second one is around foreign relations and security. China is now a security threat, an indirect security threat due to its support for Russia. And I think we'll hear a lot more about that in the second session focused on foreign policy. In terms of what can the EU offer to the global south in its deals, I think in a way it can try to recreate the sorts of complementarity that it had with China in the past. So the global south is also facing a challenging situation with China's rise. One of the really remarkable things about China's approach to industrial policy is they're trying to keep as many industries as possible based in China. So they're not willing to give up their textile industries. They're promoting a lot industrial upgrading to make that more efficient, but they want to keep everything in China as much as possible. They're not letting these lower value-added sectors to move out of China if they can avoid it. The EU can promote that and trade with other countries so that they have an opportunity to build up those sectors. I think that's really crucial, sort of engaging in a more favorable division of labor on that front. And what does China really want? Well, I feel, if I had to put it really succinctly, I don't think China really feels comfortable being simply an equal in many ways. It wants to be a leader. It wants to make sure that it is in a position where it can ensure its security. And so that means that it does want to have leverage over other countries, and at the very least have an opportunity, for its companies to be active globally all around the world, like US and European companies have been able to do in the past.
Maybe I can just, does it work? Maybe just add a little bit to that. When you look at the rhetoric, when you look at Xi Jinping's speeches, central documents and so on, there's a very clear direction of travel in the perception of China being under threat by the Americans. So they're leaving the belief that we are in some kind of a neoliberal order where trade relations, economic relations create stability and win-win situations, but increasingly we are in a more realistic, like realism-based structural order, right? Where it's about supremacy, it's about being able to defend yourself, and a much more interest-based international order. I don't think that China, and you see this, they're building a military, they're spending a lot of resources into defense, in technology, building up the military and so on, projecting power navally, and so on. So there's a very, very clear indication that China believes it needs to become, if not a fortress, at least be able to defend itself. That also goes in at the technology and industry level. When you look at technology plans, at industry plans, there's always a very clear target that China wants to be a leader, if not the leader, in technologies, in industries in 10, 20 years. So there's as Alex said, there's a very clear intention of becoming a leader. And I think that this was not necessarily in the cards when Xi Jinping started. There was a lot on cooperation, on win-win situations, but something changed, and I believe the first Trump administration really did a lot of harm. The trade war at that time. Biden doubled down, so this wasn't an anomaly, but really China came to believe that, okay, this is now the new world order. We have to defend ourselves, we have to fight for our own kind of position at the top. And now Trump too, of course, is only exacerbating everything. So I think that this belief that we are on our own, there's a window of opportunity, and this is also something that is very reoccurring in the discourse. A window of opportunity for China to come out on top. So I think this is something that Europe needs to have in mind. They want cooperation, but it is extremely interest-based, and it's a very sharp competition dynamic they are living under.
What does China expect from us? I don't think much actually. I don't think really China needs Europe. I think in China's sort of worldview, Europe doesn't matter much. It's all about the US. Maybe we matter as a market, but in sort of security, foreign policy terms, we don't matter much. And sometimes we have an overblown idea about our own position and how we can impress the Chinese. I think if we really want to deal with China and we really want to, have an influence on how policies are made in China and the decisions are made, then we need to study China more carefully. We, for example, need to figure out who are these leaders at the top who make these decisions. And if they, for example, have been to Germany, or they've been to Denmark, or they've been to Brussels, remember that and follow their careers. I have a good example. 3 of those people in the Politburo who belongs to the aerospace group, they were in Denmark on a training course for a few days when they were business leaders. Many of these leaders in China, they are rotated, and some of the top leaders now have a background in business, and then they're rotated to a governor position or party secretary position in a province, and then further up. And now some of them are in the Politburo. Actually, 5 of those who are in the current Politburo, they have visited Denmark, some several times. And I'm not quite sure. I don't want to criticize our foreign ministry, but I'm not quite sure our foreign ministry is leveraging this fact. And I think that should be done also, by the EU. Keep track on those people who have been here, because that can be really useful when you negotiate with them, when you meet them again. And then let me stress, I think Tatiana is really, really having a good point in the translation. And when you meet Chinese, when EU officials, when Danish officials meet Chinese officials, the Chinese provide the translation, the interpretation. We don't, and that is a mistake. We don't really know what is being translated. If we want to communicate our ideas, then we really need to improve our translation and interpretation services so we can get our messages across.
Okay, thanks. I want to make a point on 2 related. So what does China want from us? And I also want to go to the Global South, because I think it's exactly what China does not want from us. So on what China wants from us, I agree. Maybe we're not as important as we think we are. And we should take note. Because, we go with big intentions, and it so happens that we come empty-handed for most of the summits we have had, and I think we need to realize why this is the case. Maybe, our expectations are wrong. But beyond that, I think China wants, on the one hand, the status quo, because it's great. So, the sleepier we are, the better. This is on industrial capacity, on innovation, you name it. And also, and this brings me to your point on the US being the most important thing for China. China wants us to be as far away from the US as possible. That's obvious. So I would say this is it, but I would add Global South, don't touch. Because I think the Global South, it sounds like everybody's enjoying, but I can tell you that not everybody is enjoying what's happening. You have countries, Indonesia is a good example. So Indonesia has a huge trade deficit with China, which didn't have before. And the reason why Indonesia has a big trade deficit, so do we, is different for them, but it's still relevant. Basically, SMEs are dying because everything is imported through e-commerce, and households are becoming very indebted. And these deficits, especially in the global south, are unsustainable, totally unsustainable. So in a way, even if you were to provide a very I would say not a perfect alternative, it would still be an alternative. So in that regard, I think we really need to focus on the global south. By the way, once upon a time, we didn't even use these terms, which shows, how much we're influenced by China's policies in emerging and developing countries. And therefore, I think we need to note, okay, what China wants from us, but also what China doesn't want from us, because that is as important as what China wants from us. Yeah.
Thank you, Alicia. It's very difficult to encompass all the debates and the discussion. From what I hear, including from the panelists, I think the question we should ask ourselves, and that encompasses a lot of the debates that have taken place, and even your point, is, of course, we all agree that China is important for us. We all agree that Europe is probably important for China. Yet, China is relevant to Europe. Our question, I think, should be, can we, there is a if, and how should we be relevant to China? I am not sure that EU is relevant to China, even though we do have the means to be relevant to China. But speaking of model, speaking of voice, speaking of influence, apart from being a market, apart from being a failing political system in Chinese eyes, I cannot see how much relevant we can be. And we have to work on that because we have many arguments to be relevant to China.
Maybe I would like to address the last question that you have about the diplomacy and communication away from public scrutiny. Well, because I feel this related to our social sphere, perhaps. Well, we're not advocating any kind of Kissinger-style top level secret talks. It's more of an idea, because both research on direct rhetoric and indirect rhetoric, and also policy brief that Tang Yingyue, I think she's somewhere here with us, on the way EU is perceived in Chinese social media, show more or less the same thing, that formulaic messaging that assures our European audiences that we criticize China loud and clear, they do not resound. They do not bring any effect. So we are thinking that maybe we can explore some soft spots at like lower level, or at some areas where the party line is perhaps less tightly shown, and perhaps cultural diplomacy, cultural exchange, and dealing with the social is a part of that.
Only that I really want to give the floor to Marcin, if you don't mind, because he has not had a chance to say a word, Marcin. So if I may step in, and then maybe we go to Jean-Louis and we finish. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I am very sad that I was not able to come to Brussels today. Since the SWPS team did research on culture, I want to chip in that area. Europe is a powerhouse of culture, and it's very attractive for China. So I think we should remember about this. Talking about the economy, we should remember that cultural and content industries are a growing part of the economy. And content-wise, I think there is a lot for Europe to do. And this is a big argument in whether we are attractive and whether we are interesting for China or not. And also in your previous discussion, you also talked about several areas without mentioning how competitive and creative China is. The 2025 WIPO list of the innovation index just came out. China is 10 this year. It's climbing up the innovation index. And I think one of the reasons why we really should cooperate closely with China is to understand what innovations are there. I know about innovations in the cultural industry, you know about other ones. I mean, if we are not closely watching, then, the content industry from China will just basically win over our populations. And we need not to block them, but we need to compete and we need to be as innovative as China. And I think this is something that we should concentrate on. Thank you.
Jean-Louis, you want to add?
I would like about what China is expecting from us. I think I don't know. What I know about a little bit is what for example, the scholars or the artists or many people who are thinking about their living and working conditions in China are expecting, I would say, from us. I think they expect precisely, we understand that in China, politics is important as well, but you can live your own life, without having any contact with the party, the big party, repressing and suppressing, etc., etc. Now there are a relatively large room for maneuver to individuals, to decide in a certain type of thing. And precisely would like, just to mention again the vast cultural phenomena we have trained we have now in China, where, for example, young people don't want to have the same life their parents had in the past. They would like to have a rest. They would like to avoid the rat race. They would like not to have responsibility all the time, to marry at a certain age, to have a baby at a certain age, to do that, etc., etc., and to have some time for themselves to a certain extent, And that is important to understand that, the Chinese society doesn't look like the Chinese society even, I would say, 10 years ago, just before the lockdown. There is really a very deep change, but once again, every time in Europe, when we have a change in the Chinese society, we are waiting for political change. Immediately, people in the street and protesting, etc. It's sorry for that, but it's relatively silly attitudes. When you are not happy in Europe, we are not all the ways in the street, except today. In Brussels, we are not every time protesting in the street and really fighting and expecting riots and so and so. I think it's very important that most Chinese are between the two, as we say. They are protesting, they are not happy, but they are not ready, for the time being, to overthrow the system and to change the system. That's, I think, a very important point.
I think we're already over time, so handing it quickly back to Alicia, but not without apologizing to those online. I know there were a couple of more questions. I don't see them anymore. Apologies. But there's a second part of this conference, and I feel that many of these questions also related to foreign policy, which is actually more sort of the subject of the afternoon. So back to you, Alicia. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And we have 10 minutes break. That's all I'm going to say. Enjoy your 10 minutes. We'll be back on time.
Hi, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to our final conference celebrating 3 years of research on China from our consortium of research institutions ranging across Europe. We're just about ready to begin along with our presenters in person and online. Just to have a little bit of an introduction on what these two panels will cover. The first one is going to be on what we call Working Package 5 on China's foreign policy. We've titled it Big Shoes to Fill, encompassing the way that China is beginning to assert itself in the world in its foreign policy and what this may look like moving forward, the role that it's set to assume. For that, we'll have myself. My name is Theo Storella. I'm a research analyst at Bruegel. And our working package leader is Jean-François Dimelieu from the Asia Center. And from there, we're going to move on to the second panel for WP6. And this is specifically on China-EU relations, which has been a major focus of our consortium's research. Not just looking at China in its domestic and global contexts, but also specifically with relevance to the EU and to our policymakers. So for that panel, we have a very well-titled piece called Secure, Smart, and Selective Policy Options for Resilient EU-China Engagement. The chair of this panel is going to be our leader, Gregor Steck from Merix, a senior analyst at Merix. And finally, joining us online will be a colleague of ours at Bruegel, Dr. Xu Jianwei, and he should be joining us from Hong Kong, I believe. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce or pass the mic to Jean-François Dimelieu to tell us about Big Shoes to Fill, China's growing foreign policy footprint.
Thank you very much, Theo. Is it working? Yes?
It will.
Good? Okay. Yes, so we've been working for 3 years. It's not working. Yeah, we've been working for 3 years, which is a lot, should we say, but is obviously not enough, even with our excellent partners in the work package 5 on international relations. So it's true that we focused on some aspects of China's international policy. I hope that if we have the opportunity to work again with the European Commission on China, we can also open up to US-China relations, which we did not cover a lot, and of course have a huge weight on the issue. We have worked a lot on China and Global South, generally speaking, China and the rest of Asia throughout quite a few papers, policy briefs, podcasts, which of course you can find again on the China Horizons website. We, of course, try to analyze the very rough sentiment in the European audience and challenge it maybe that China Rise is, because we called our program Dealing with a Resurgent China, that China Rise was irresistible and that it was a one-way street. Of course, we cannot challenge that, and all the assessment that we finish with does include the fact that China's footprint is, by large, bigger 3 years after we started our program than it used to be. Obviously, China's footprint, be it on the economy, be it in the relations with other countries, be it in international institutions, be it in global governance, is of course bigger. You can name it. The regional or so-called regional institutions which China is part of, but is more and more an active part of, is not the leader of. Originally, even though the organizations, for example, is called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it was not necessarily led by China, but everything looks like China's influence is bigger and bigger. look at the Tianjin summit on 2nd of September. Look at the fact that countries sometimes really are in a collision course with China, like India, are now part of such institutions. Of course, the BRICS is not as well an institution led by China, but it's more and more feeling the bigger footprint of China. And among the other examples we are taking is the fact that there is a real success by China in decoupling, the word was used earlier, de-risking. We speak in Europe about de-risking, but China has started with its strategic autonomy policy to de-risk vis-à-vis its partners. And in terms of trade war, we can question, of course, the jury is still out, especially as we speak now, and especially with the rare earth debate. Jury is still out, but we can really question who is the winner there. And finally, the Plan 2025 has given room for China to gain a lot of advance in many fields. We all know about the electric vehicles. We all know about renewable energies. So that's a big footprint in many areas. Yet, this footprint, Bigfoot, we also compare it with, if you allow us, the fact that when you have big shoes, it doesn't mean that your feet fit in the shoes. And we thought about China's ancient times when the feet were, women's feet were bound. And they had all the potential. If you remember, Mao said that women carry half of the world. Yes, they do, but at the time they had bound feet, meaning that all their potential was really limited and self-limited by a culture, by a feeling, by an environment, a social environment, which set limits on all that potential that Chinese women had at the time. So you may challenge this comparison, but we found some elements, I shouldn't say elements which should give us hope that there is room for dialogue, that there is room for identifying Chinese weaknesses, but probably room to look at China's foreign policy in a different way. WP5 is about foreign relations, of course, but we cannot totally disconnect foreign relations from the trade issues. And one of the weaknesses we identify in China's current stance is the fact that when you basically master 50% of global trade, you're not sure that you're a master of the trade, because that means that you are extremely dependent on trade. And what analysis shows is that Chinese leaders have a really hard time changing this pattern and growing consumption as a secondary engine for growth. Same with the monetary system. Of course, there has been huge progress in terms of opening up the trade account for sure, less on the capital account, which leads to the observation that in terms of ranking, China's renminbi is way behind what China's trade position in the world is. So those are the first observations. But again, if we look at the footprint in terms of how often do we see Chinese leaders, how often do Chinese leaders show their face abroad, how often they travel. That's really a measure of their footprints. How many footprints can you find in Russia? How many Chinese footprints can you find in Europe? How many footprints can you find in Africa? A lot. So be it Xi Jinping, be it Li Keqiang before, be it Li Qiang now, be it Wang Yi. Of course, they travel a lot. Not only do they travel a lot, but as I mentioned, they are also part of many, many international meetings. And they are part of all those I mentioned. You also have the FOCAC, the China-Africa Forum, which is very, very important. And last but not least, because it's very recent, after having invented a few acronyms like GDI and all that sort, now China is talking about GGI, Global Governance Initiative. So that's very ambitious because that means that definitely that footprint of China can come also on the way China will influence global governance as opposed to the old instruments that China and Chinese leaders may consider obsolete now. Small footprint though, or bound feet, BRI. There is an open question about BRI. BRI was very impressive when it was launched in 2013. The two Belt and Road, maritime and land roads. There were two summits before our 3-year bracket of time for our studies, but there's only one in the recent times, only one BRI forum in Beijing. So does it mean that this big initiative is fading away? Does it mean that when China has such initiatives, when success comes, yes, there is definitely a follow-up, but when success fails to be up to the expectations, a change of tack may challenge the initiative and may question the relevance of the direction which was shown. And this is why we come to this expression of bound feet. How can we explain that sometimes China is not up, or China's foreign policy is not up to the positioning that China has? Look at the conflicts, look at, of course, the Ukraine conflict. If, yes, we can say that there is a trend, and especially with the recent meetings with North Korea attending the 2nd and the 3rd of September meetings, it looks like China is getting closer to Russia and there is a kind of coalition building. Yet you can say that India was present on the 2nd of September. Modi was not, for many reasons, but Modi was not present at this famous parade on the 3rd of September. And when we talk about this parade on the 3rd of September, WP5 did not cover at all the strategic issues and the military aspects of China's rise. But this September 3rd parade did conceal, in some ways, a lot of disruptions in the military order within PLA. Once again, big impact. You see the show, it's really impressive. How does really PLA function internally? And if it doesn't function the way we think it should function as a big army, who did bind the army's feet? Is it the party itself, which is so much in contradiction with its role vis-à-vis the army? Is it because of course, arguments between the army, the party, the leadership? Yes, everything like this. But it's a huge limitation to what we can see. Also, on the international crisis, and even though China is part, of course, of the permanent member of Security Council, you see initiatives coming from Russia in the crisis. You see initiatives, should I say, even for France, including in the Gaza crisis. I don't know how much France's voice was heard, but at least it was voiced, and it could be somewhat heard, whereas China's position in such crisis is not vocal at all. It's not subdued, but once again, it's not up to what one could expect. So, in a nutshell, we see a lot of dynamism. This dynamism definitely corresponds to the rise of China. We see a lot of innovation as well. This morning, we also presented China's push in diplomatic areas, non-diplomatic areas as well, influence. And we may see more influence later on. We can see China's presence in a crisis, but once again, more subdued. There is probably an area which should be watched and is totally outside of the scope that we covered, but might be the real field of confrontation or the real field of innovation in terms of international relations, the one about standards. And when we speak about standards, of course, digital standards come up first. The footprint so far is not really visible from Europe, but we know it's growing if we look at DeepSeek, but if we look also at the infrastructures. And if we had to extend our research, our analysis, we would have put a big stress, which would have led us actually also to look at the confrontation between US and China, because this is the main field of confrontation in the future. Probably there will be some contributions from the audience, because one member of Asia Center works a lot on those digital issues, namely Jean-Baptiste Monnier, who is in the audience, and maybe we will elaborate on that one. So I wrap up my presentation here, and Theo, the floor is yours.
So much of what you said, Jean-François. I would really just want to build on certain points where a lot of the research that I've conducted as part of the DWAR consortium has really figured onto its relationship with international organizations and with multilateral organizations, with global governance, and what that's looked like over so long. So in titling this piece, we really see China changing its position from one that was more conservative, staying more on the sidelines back in the day, to really stepping out onto the global stage when it comes to its participation in global initiatives like the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilizations Initiative, the Global Governance Initiative, the 人民共同体 人民命运共同体. It is the collective humanity and the future of all people. These are all ways that China is trying to create an umbrella for what it understands to be a new world order, and it's increasingly confident in promulgating and promoting these initiatives directly to an international audience, whereas before it might first workshop them at home a little bit first. In the way that China places previous structures of global governance in its new idea of a world order, I find that tremendously interesting. Always stating, for example, that it sees the United Nations as the center of global governance, as the WTO as the mediator of international trade. These are things that it supports both in its speech, but also somewhat in its actions when it has, for example, just most recently, after years and years of controversy, decided to let go of the benefits that go along at the WTO with calling itself a developing nation. There's a lot to look into that in the self-identification of countries as developing nations entitled to certain areas of trade protectionism. China has consistently modeled itself as the leader of, in some ways, the developing world. And so as a flagship bearer, as a country that's undergone the horrors of of imperialism throughout time, it sees that as a political identity, which used to also come with economic rights that were given to it in the WTO and the system. It has most recently abandoned that. When we look at its understanding of the United Nations, we see representatives of China going through election processes or mobilizing at the United Nations to become leaders of different organs of the United Nations, different agencies there, whether it's the Food and Agriculture Organization or the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. These are extremely critical areas of the United Nations, even though its voluntary contributions to a lot of UN agencies still remains low. And when it looks to create these global initiatives that can be extremely effective, and as we saw in one of our policy briefs, garnering global or international support, widespread uptake and use of its standards, of its ideas in international parlance, China sometimes centers global United Nations goals. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were placed at the very heart of its Global Development Initiative. This gives China a great deal of agility and a great deal of, believability when it's pushing these global initiatives across the world. And you see it in the data. A lot of what we did at Bruegel and at this consortium is empirical to find statistical ways to quantify China's influence in the world. And we've done that through cutting-edge methodologies and also in consultation with tremendous partners from European policy institutes, including the EAS. We should absolutely shout out Marine Bouissou in helping us understand this world, and also Moritz Rudolph from DG IDEA. This consortium has benefited tremendously from the types of relationships we've been able to draw on to inform our focuses of research. I would say just on the way that China is not just operating effectively within existing international institutions, but also creating ones outside of it, where you start to see real decision-making on important issues that are going on at ASEAN, that are going on at the SCO, that are going on at the China-Arab Cooperation Forum, that are going on at the China-Africa Cooperation Forum. There are tremendous systems of global governance that are taking shape in this world, promulgated by China, which, to be honest, Europe is mostly absent from, but that really groups together a lot of emerging economies into positions of solidarity on some issues, conflict in others. That should not be forgotten. But that's a tremendous trend that we're seeing across the world today. And even in areas where China has had previously horrible conflicts with its neighbors. I'm thinking of the China-India clashes that claimed the lives of dozens of soldiers, of Chinese and Indian soldiers from back in the day. We've seen, I think it's now 23 or 25 different meetings between basically the border czars in China and India over the past few years to be able to resolve these conflicts and to be able to manage them. When it comes to the conflicts that China has with its neighbors in the WTO, we see countries from across the world. I hope those are the protesters. We see countries from across the world, including emerging economies, that are bringing cases against China at the WTO and trying to rely on what's left of the WTO's interim mechanism for resolving these conflicts. We see Malaysia, we see India bringing lots of cases, including Brazil. Merix has done tremendous work on this to be able to map out exactly which countries have brought cases against China, whether it's on importation of goods or e-commerce duties or all types of things. When we're looking at the dynamism of China moving forward, I think we all need to strike a balance, and I think this is so much of what the effort that Europe is engaged in today, and so many of us in this room are trying to figure out, is the balance of understanding China's, in some ways it's right to have a growing influence of the world as its economy grows, as it over and over promotes these global initiatives, as it tries to stake out a position where the world stands to benefit to it, participating rather than staying on the sidelines. Striking a balance between that and then also preserving sort of the essence and the core functions, the benefits of the international system that was built after the Second World War. That is very much the exercise that we're all trying to engage in this consortium, and many of us, all of us probably in this room today. So looking down the line of what some of its most quintessential initiatives might look like moving forward, including the BRI, we see that it's obviously gone through the 小而美 phase of trying to figure out sustainability-driven, smaller-scale projects that can be more impactful and more accountable over time, but then also trying to keep it sustained as a global flagship initiative for China. And this shapes along with a lot of what China is doing in other initiatives more broadly, and trying to make them, keep them beneficial and sustainable for China, but still have them be a source of assembly for emerging economies across the globe, and trying to make them sustainably beneficial to China itself. There's obviously a great deal of self-interest in a lot of these actions. So in moving towards the outputs that we've put for this WP5, I would cite that something really special about this consortium's work and about China Horizons in general is the public nature of so much of our work. I think that one of the driving motives behind this is to create a better educated set of people in the European Union, among the general population, among universities, among policymakers, consultants, and business executives. And to that end, every single one of the outputs that we've done for this project, whether it be our policy briefs, our podcasts, our dissemination events, our first glances, which have tried our best to keep up to date with the cutting edge developments of China, EU, and China's international foreign policy relations. All of that is public and accessible on our website that I would direct you to at chinahorizons.eu. I would just say that it's been a tremendous privilege to be able to participate in this kind of work over the past few years. And as we look towards what China is going to become moving forward, including its participation in international organizations, its own institutions of global governance, and what might come next, I think that we're filled with a little bit of trepidation, but also a lot of hope. I think that it's better to lead with that than the alternative. So I hope that we can walk forward into the next phase of China's relationships with the international community in that vein and see where it takes us. So without further ado, I think we're basically going to move on to the working package 6, what we call working packages in this, which is basically focused on China-EU relations. So very specifically zooming in to how China has related in its trade and its foreign policy relations to the EU. We're lucky to have with us today Gregor Steck, senior analyst at Merix, and as we were saying, Xu Jianwei joining us all the way from Hong Kong. We're going to be titling this Smart, Secure, and Selective, as we said at the intro, and I'm very happy to hand the stage over to our colleague and friend Gregor Steck.
Thank you very much, Theo, and hello, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to say a quick word of thank you to all the colleagues that we worked together with on this entire consortium, and especially to colleagues from Bruegel from organizing this. Rutger, I think special thanks go to you. In terms of the work that we have done on Work Package 6, a lot of the themes that have already appeared in the previous panel, the question of China's dynamism, confidence, influence, we've been looking into that in Work Package 6 on EU-China relations. Some of the themes that we looked at were the question of the three-body problem between EU, US, and China, the question of China's changing attitudes towards Europe, and the change in tactical way of managing Europe, and also the question of resilience building across Europe. That is absolutely crucial in terms of how do we navigate the challenge ahead. So if we can maybe move to the slides, I'll grab this and bring it back. I want to give you some of the key takeaways from the different parts of the work that we've conducted as part of this work package. First, looking at the foresight workshops work, the forecasts, and also the opinion polls, where we tried to gather the opinions of different European stakeholders and experts working on China. There are, I think, 3 key trends that you should keep in mind that are going to be relevant for you regardless whether you work on economy, security, or on foreign policy as such. First of all, it's the fact that it seems that Trump Trump's return solidified the struggle doctrine in Beijing's handling of geopolitical competition. And we see that in this focus of China and going towards a tit-for-tat solutions or even escalatory approach. That applies also to Europe, and this is something that we should be expecting to see more in terms of more active retaliations to measures coming from Europe, in some cases even preemptive usage of China's economic security toolkit. And this is something that is already unfolding in the context of rare earths. So definitely a trend that we should be watching and expect intensifying. The second trend is related to China's focus on doubling down on the techno-industrial policy. And this is something that was already mentioned and covered quite extensively in the previous set of panels. But I just want to double down on the fact that this really collides with the EU's economy. We already see that happening in terms of specific sectors, whether that's batteries, automotive. There will be more, and that was also highlighted in the previous segment, in terms of new sectors that are going to be challenged in this way. And there is also a very big challenge that we are dealing with in the context of vulnerability of our defense industry, in the context of especially rare earths. So in other words, don't expect China to really change. We're going to have to adapt our approach towards what we've been seeing coming from the Chinese side already. The third trend relates to the transatlantic cooperation that has been evolving towards, you could call it coercive coordination of the EU by Washington, or in some cases even attempts by Washington to use the EU's position on China as a negotiation card vis-a-vis Beijing. This is, of course, interpretation of the, and open for interpretation in terms of the specific intentions coming from the Trump administration, but clearly what we have noted is either the question of silence and disruption of exchanges with the transatlantic partners, which for many European actors demotivates them from acting more robustly and quickly in the context of building resilience vis-a-vis China, or the question of coercion and push for Europe to act in ways that maybe are not necessarily always fully aligned with how do we see our own interests. So all of that points us to the direction that we're entering the moment in EU-China relations where the EU needs to gear up for more struggle in its relationship with China. The challenges are simply mounting, and the urgency to address them is absolutely huge. That leads me to the second package, a basket of work that we've conducted related to resilience. So those are the trends, how are we responding to them? And this was a comparative exercise that we carried out through mapping vulnerabilities and resilience building measures introduced by 11 European countries, 10 EU member states plus UK. We looked at 98 indicators, and we also complemented that with 11 dedicated qualitative assessments of how resilience building is progressing in those specific countries, plus specific analysis on topics that we wanted to zoom in on. And here are 3 takeaways that I would want you to take away from this exercise if those are the only 3 that you're going to take. First of all, it's the fact that vulnerabilities increase on the side of Europe, or weaponization of our vulnerabilities by China is progressing and increasing at a pace that outpaces our resilience building on the level of member states. We are simply not fast enough for the task ahead. And this is a very big challenge, especially that even in those areas where we have seen progress, it's very fragmented. And I mean by this that, for example, if you take a look at measures introduced in the context of knowledge security, in the context of 5G policies and handling Huawei, in the context of cybersecurity measures, or for example, only 2 countries have actually responded with clear guidelines to their governments, or at least publicly, on DeepSeek and on the usage of DeepSeek in public sector. There is a question of national China strategies that is also very much fragmented across Europe. This is not uneven work, and this fragmentation is largely our weakness. The second point, and that's looking at the glass half full rather than half empty, is that what this fragmentation means is that some countries are performing better than others. So there is a lot of room for member states to learn from one another or to implement similar solutions that are already existing in Europe in the context of the new countries that have not introduced those measures. We see that in the context of China competence building in national administrations. I can see some of the colleagues here working, for example, through CKN. The Netherlands have been doing a lot of work in that context. FDI screening, there are also countries such as Czech Republic that have introduced quite stringent measures. Or the question of knowledge security, where also specific member states have institutionalized structures for dealing with that. Others do not even having guidelines on how to handle knowledge security. So this is a really fragmented landscape, which gives us a lot of opportunities to learn from one another, but we're very vulnerable because of that. But the third and core issue that I think we should be taking away is that we have a tendency in Europe to fall into a focus on specific policy tools and the toolbox mentality. Whereas in the end of the day, the key problem that we have is largely political. It's lack of implementation, it's lack of coordination, and it's lack of political will. To a large extent, it's not really about developing new tools, but rather acting on the ones that we have. Partially, the whole exercise with the economic security doctrine that is happening right now is about how do we make that better. But it's very much about action. This is something that we have seen in our context where, for example, Hungary has developed quite a lot of resilience building measures. Is it going to use it vis-a-vis China? Not necessarily. And this is a political question in the end of the day in terms of how the tools in terms of FDI screening, for example, are used and deployed. Those are political questions fundamentally. So in the policy briefs that we've gone through in that context, we noted the need for an action-oriented European China policy, and something that Alicia already talked about in the previous set of panels, so the question of achieving coexistence with China, which at the same time would secure our interests and our values. And this is definitely a very tough ask and tall order, but we have some of the suggestions out there, and I will get to them in a little bit. There is also the question of how the landscape is changing for our European companies, the work that has been conducted by colleagues from Bruegel in terms of market becoming less attractive with lower profits, with rising pressure, with reduced prospects of expansion for European companies in China. So the El Dorado is over. It's a question of how do we navigate it, how do we change that. But jumping maybe very quickly through the graphics, it's just something to try to attract your attention to the work that we have done. There is a lot of graphs, data that we invite you to engage with within the work that we have conducted as the consortium. But jumping quickly to the recommendations, because this is the key part in the end of the day in terms of what do we recommend to do about those challenges ahead. First of all, it's about bracing for shocks and retaliations. This is definitely coming our way in the context of China, and the work on economic security doctrine that is being conducted, or on deterrence capacity, which is also partially the discussion that we're having right now in Brussels on China. It's the question of evaluating, defining acceptable costs, defining the trade-offs, because to a large extent, we're all talking about leverage. We're talking about market access being the leverage. We're talking about ASML being the leverage, many different leverages and choke points that we're discussing. But the quick question is our credibility and our resilience when we're going to encounter China's response. So this is definitely an activity that we have to go through and we have to brace for. The second point is about empowering the member states to get better on China policy. To a large extent, especially a number of member states are simply not equipped enough for the task. And this is something for Brussels to work on, as much and as challenging this can be. Of course, there were already many attempts in terms of 5G guidelines, for example, that have been challenging to implement in a coherent way across Europe. but still there is a need for more guidelines, push for risk assessments, and improved policy coordination. Here, the recommendation from our side was also, for example, creating something akin to the US-China House, but in a European fashion that would help us coordinate the positions. Getting the risking done in a way is very, very important. It's also the engagement part. So that relates to the need for more comprehensive usage of economic statecraft with new tools, outbound investment screening, coordinated export controls, getting simply better in that context of using them as well, having the new tools, but making use of the ones that we already have, but also engaging China in a resilient way. And that's exactly the safe, smart, selective approach, which means pre- and post-engagement coordination that needs to be better also on the level of member states. The communication as deterrence, not necessarily treating every meeting as something that needs to have a positive deliverable. Sometimes it's also about communicating to China the deterrence measures on specific policies that we want to, or behaviors that we want to prevent. And it's also about tracking China's commitments to a large extent. We need to get more transactional in a way that we engage with China, and that requires really tracking and linking specific actions between us and Beijing. And fundamentally, if you think about it, the solutions to a lot of those challenges are not exactly in bilateral relations. They are in what we do ourselves or what we do with the partners. That relates to the question from the previous panel, what China wants from us. I think that China really has a preventive agenda vis-a-vis Europe. It's about preventing transatlantic coordination that could lead to China containment. It's about preventing the limitations on the access to European market, and it's about preventing the limitations on access to European technology. None of that requires China to convince us to do anything. It's just about preventing us from getting more serious on resilience building, on the risking, and on other measures. And when it comes to the transatlantic coordination, this is largely taking care of itself right now. So this is what points me to the final point on this, and that's the question of forging diverse partnerships with like-minded, but also with emerging economies. I think this is crucial that we think beyond like-minded, with topical coalitions, with quick deals that help us reduce the dependency and increase our deterrence capacity vis-a-vis China. And here, for example, the CRM deals that have been pursued already could be something that gets implemented towards new strategic sectors. And if I am still allowed, because I have, I think, 25 seconds, the final point I want to end on is the question of improving integration of China knowledge into administrations. Already the work that we were empowered to do as work, I think this is already something for which as a community we're very grateful. There is simply much more work to do. The China Fellowship program, of course, was also, for example, one of those great signals. There are more of this kind of systems that are being introduced also on the level of member states, but we simply need to channel China knowledge a little bit more and a little bit better. We have the resources, we need to get smarter about using them, and this is also something that we've been trying to do as this consortium, and I'm sure we'll continue to do even after we finish. And with that, let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Greg. We're going to be moving to Xu Jianwei, a non-resident fellow at Bruegel. Jianwei, can you hear us? Are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh,
can you hear me?
We hear you loud and clear. We're going to get the slides off just now, and we're happy to hear you.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me for this event. So I will first introduce our work with Alicia on China EU. Basically, in addition to the macroeconomic topics that we are usually writing about, we also have a number of sectoral level analysis with a special focus on technological dependence and also green transition. So Alicia and our team member has written a paper about the EU's reliance on China for green technology, including batteries, solar panels, critical material minerals, which could be a risk for European Union, and so it's important to diversify supply chain. But in order to achieve that, it's also important to have join the collaboration with China on research and development, and also to strengthen the green tech, capacity, to strengthen the resilience, and to achieve the decarbonization. And we also worked on several other critical technology, topics like AI, semiconductor, quantum computing, and we use large language models to identify those especially important, technological, advancement in the world, and how China and the EU can collaborate, and also, reduce the risks to move toward the innovation, innovation works. So I first want to highlight that we are not only doing the macro studies, so sectoral and special focus on the key sectors is also one achievement of our researchers for the China EU project. So that's for the introduction side, and I have still a few minutes. So I just want, because I have been hearing about the discussion so far. So I have also one slight point I want to talk about. I know that the China EU trade has been a key focus of our analysis, and I don't have the chart being presented to you, but I want to give you a question. So if we add Germany, France, Spain, and Italy as a whole, basically the major European economies, and check their trade balance with China. So I can tell you that from 2000 to a specific year, it's nearly balanced. So China, European, economic situation, trade situation was not unbalanced from the start, was quite balanced. This imbalance, which means China's huge surplus vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis the European countries, starting from a specific year. I don't know whether you know which year it is. I'll give you the answer. It's 2021. It's 2021. So although I fully agree that there are structural problems and even subsidies and other long-term factors that are at play, but I just want to highlight that this huge imbalance is not something that is starting from the beginning. It's just less than about 4 years, from now. There's something happening, within the 4 years. That's also important. In addition to those long-term, factors that we are all focused on, or the meeting is quite focused on, but there are some also short-term, issues I think people need to focus. So in my opinion, I give you one answer, which I have, but it may not be the only answer. I think that the inflation difference is a key problem. If you look at the China EU Eurozone inflation comparison, you can see that Europe has a quite low inflation before 2021. But after 2021, we all know what has happened in Europe. Why this is important? Because inflation is also your cost of production. So with high inflation, the cost of production is quite high, right? But for China, because so far the country, my country has very little inflation, so the cost of production is very low, and apparently exchange rate does not reflect the difference in the inflation. So you can see that there's a price advantage coming from exchange rate, and that has contributed, in my opinion, massively to China's cost comparative advantage, in the recent 4 years. I don't want to talk too much about this, and I just want to highlight that there's something not novelty, but not so structural, that also needs our thinking in addition to the structural issues. I'll stop here, and very happy to have the opportunity to present in the event. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jian Wei. We're now going to welcome to the stage Mr. Antoine Bondaz from DJ IDEA. Thank you so much for being with us. we'd love to hear your thoughts on this and so many other issues. But again, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot. Just to clarify, I don't come as a messenger from the Commission, so I'll speak in my individual capacity. The first thing is thanks a lot for the whole consortium, for everything you've done over the last few years. Coming from the think tank, I know the dedication. I also know sometimes the frustration on not being heard. And I know also that the political leadership sometimes is not always grateful when good ideas are coming from the civil society. But I think it's very important for the political leadership and for the administration to listen, to learn. Don't hesitate to always reach out to public administration. We cannot follow everything. Sometimes we're a bit busy. We are, doing firefighting every single day. But don't hesitate, once again, to reach out, to send your publication, to ask for coffees and stuff. Just to start, I think China matters. We all agree. But we also need to understand that at every political level now, people tend to realize that China is a systemic actor. It's not a judgment whether it's good or bad. It's a fact. China is systemic. And because China is systemic, it means China is impacting any daily work in any administration. And it also means that China needs to be considered as something very mainstream. So you need to put the China factor into any single political equation today, whether you work on trade, whether you work on security, whether you also work on democracy, on energy, on climate, etc. And from that, it means something very basic that you highlighted through the consortium, that we need more China expertise. We need more updated data. This is sometimes what we lack. Even from the Commission, when you use data from 2022, 2023, I'm sorry, but that's not good. We should have the latest updated data, especially on trade. The data of 2023 and the data of today are completely different because the situation has worsened, the trade imbalances have deepened way more. It also means we need more China literacy, and clearly this consortium did part of that. And once again, I insist, we need to mainstream China into all of our policies. As Greg mentioned, China is changing, but we may not be the factor why China is changing. And it also means that we need to change ourselves sometimes. We can no longer expect China to change. We need to change ourselves if we want things to evolve. We need to be very humble. It does not mean to become confrontational with China. It means to craft policies that defend our interests, that are not policies against China or about the US, because I know that very often the US is being put in the equation, but this is all about us, about the Europeans, our interests, how to defend themselves. Engagement will always be a top priority. As you know, the president went to China in July. She made it very clear, but we also need to ensure that engagement can deliver. Because if engagement cannot deliver, then it's very hard to go back to your constituency and explain that we keep talking, but nothing is changing. So we need to keep engaging, but we also need to build up our own capacity, our own leverage, and defend ourselves. And on that, I would have 4 very broad questions to the 2 previous panel. The first one on the footprint of China's footprints growing, and on the fact that China won't change because we want it to change. The key question now is how do we keep defending our interests? China's footprint in the world is going to keep increasing. That's a fact. So the question is not whether we oppose it or not. I think it's a known question. The question is how does it impact us? And how do we invest our limited resources, being financial resources, political resources, HR, literally, resources, on what matters to us? And the question is, for you, what would be kind of the top priority sectors in which we really should focus our resources? The second, you talk about multilateralism, governance, etc. It's very clear that China is doing both selective and alternative multilateralism, being on global standards, both joining international organizations, but also doing side bilateral or multi-bilateral deals on global standards. There is sometimes a disconnect between international organizations and the Chinese narrative within international organization and the reality. Take humanitarian aid. China called on the UN to do much more on humanitarian aid. We all agree. China, in terms of voluntary contributions to UNHCR, UNOCHA, the organization to coordinate humanitarian aid, UNICEF, UNWFP is less than 0.1% of the budget. So China is not funding, through voluntary contributions, this kind of humanitarian-related UN institutions. So China is contributing to the UN general budget, regular budget, but not as voluntary contributions to this kind of humanitarian assistance targeted institution. To give you the difference, I mean, I think Team Europe is between 1/3 and 2/3 of the budget of these institutions. So it means that if these institutions don't have budget, they cannot implement any single project on the ground. So the key question is, what is the form of leadership, or would you characterize the form of leadership that China is or is willing to have on the international scene? The third one is, you mentioned it a lot, on de-risking. To be very clear, China is de-risking and we are not. Or at least China is de-risking way faster than we are. China is diversifying its trade very, very rapidly. In 5 years, the share of trade it has with the G7 has dropped by 7 percentage points. Today, China trades more with Malaysia than with Germany, more with the Philippines than with Italy. That's the new reality. Export to Latin America, Africa, and the ASEAN have doubled basically over the last 5 years. You know, I know that some people sometimes still believe, and you mentioned it, that the EU is the biggest trade partner of China. Clearly not anymore. ASEAN is by 30%, not by 2 or 3%, by 30%. So basically is, how do we kind of not only react to how China is de-risking, but how do we integrate the fact that China is not only catching up, and once again, that the right of China to catch up, and as a Chinese, I would do the same. I would like to catch up. But not only to catch up, but to lead. And we see it from the move from Made in China 2025, which was mostly about catching up, to the so-called new productive forces or else that are about leading in new sectors. So what is the impact for the EU? And very finally, the question of resilience and partnership. I think we all agree, so you can have the whole debate on allied scale, or so-called allied scale, on EU plus trusted partners, the question of trustworthiness standards, etc. The question is very concretely, how do we improve coordination and cooperation with our key partners? And I don't use even like-minded, it's beyond that. It's not whether you are a like-minded democracy or an OECD country. Trusted partners can be Congo on CRM, can be Chile on lithium, can be Indonesia on some manufacturing, can be India on solar panel manufacturing, etc. So it's a very broad approach. But the question is, how do we improve that coordination when at home sometimes we fail to even do it? So I'm all in, and I'm pushing very strongly for that. But how do we concretely improve cooperation, coordination, when even at the G7, to be very honest, these days it's more complicated? So my first series of questions, and then of course I will get all of the questions from the room.
First, just thank you so much. These are the fundamental questions, and I would turn first to oh captain, my captain, Jean-François. Would you like to start us off?
First of all, just to pick up on Antoine's speech, maybe we put a very big stress at Asia Center now on this issue, on the digital sovereignty issue. How would you see Europe's stance in the future? Then have also a question for you, if I may. Is that the game or not? because I would like to pick up then on what you said. But, Antoine.
On digital sovereignty, I won't comment. I'm not here to comment on the Commission, so I won't. But when you have the title of one of the EVP, Virkkunen, being on technological sovereignty, I think it means a lot on the priorities. Then the question is always, you have the political priorities, how do you define and design good policies, and how do you implement? I agree, we very often have a design problem. We have an implementation problem. But once again, I won't comment on that. But once again, on technological sovereignty, I think it's clearly a top priority of the Commission today.
May I? Yeah, if I may. Yeah, because you said not all European countries are equal vis-à-vis China. That was basically your point. And your recommendation that, in a way, you didn't state this way, but I read between the lines. We should all align on the best practices. Am I right? How come we do not align on the best practices? And how come could we align on the best practices when you see that practices are diverging so much?
Thank you very much. I have, it was basically a round of questions. I'll try to go super quickly in a very think tanky style. On the Chinese footprint increasing and our limited resources, I think I would go first by the industries that are absolutely critical for us. So the ones that we define as, CRMs is the absolutely obvious one. This is the urgent thing. I would basically focus most of the resources that we have currently on this, and focus then, once we have the capacity to respond to those immediate challenges, on the technologies that we see coming up in 5 to 10 years down the line. So trying to build for the next round rather than necessarily responding to the issues on which we might be already dropping the ball anyway. On the China in UN and the response, the form of leadership that China has, I would tackle this in a way that this is very much about channeling discontent. I think very often a number of initiatives that we've seen coming from China, they don't necessarily propose, they are not concrete plans. They don't propose concrete solutions, but they are very good at channeling the dissatisfaction, very often legitimate, that exists in the system. So this is where I would see this leadership as an ability to channel that for the goals that are relevant for China. For example, the question of introducing the standards is there. So how do we respond to that? I think this is largely about talking with our partners that are actually dissatisfied about this. And this is not particularly, extremely surprising, but if we have the Global Gateway Forum to which not many Europeans show up, that sends a signal. And I think we just need to get better on that and do the footprint, do the legwork that's in those conversations. On the question of the risking and how do we react to China de-risking, that's exactly where I think is it's key to find where the dissatisfaction with China exists in the world, because this already links to your final question of how do we improve this coordination. I think with many of the partners, especially the ones that are not like-minded, we don't really have much scope to just work on China. There's not going to be necessarily that much willingness to do that. But working together on specific issue that is of common concern, that is on China, I think is the way to do it. So once again, becoming more sectoral and specific on that. Finally, on aligning on best practices, why this is a problem, I think this is largely the question of capacity of the government. Sometimes the governments simply don't invest resources, not seeing something as priority. Where we've seen the governments progressing in terms of building resilience on China, were largely in very broad terms, so we can find also counterexamples, but broadly two situations. One, when they were burnt by China, and they were doing that in response, or two, a situation in which they had specific assets they want to protect. So it's very much a reactive way. And I think this is, again, something to which we need a political solution. We just need a change of our strategic culture to this and trying to be preemptive in that sense. So there is no silver bullet on this one, apart from just, going through the tough work and working on those resilience measures. Because even when the EU is doing great work in terms of introducing guidelines, in the end of the day, because of the competences, the member states need to step up and just implement.
That I think, Mr. Bondas, you brought up something that's critically important with China's functions in the UN and the kind of leadership that it's trying to promote, where a lot of the UN's most critical organizations or its agencies, they function mostly based on voluntary contributions. So this is called voluntary. You might think of it in terms of something small or lending a helping hand, but it's not. It's absolutely critical to the functions of the United Nations, and sometimes in its most important actions. So China is contributing more and more as its GDP grows for its assessed contributions. It's also participating quite a bit in peacekeeping efforts, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think an effective demand that the international community can present to China is that it step up to the plate when it comes to these voluntary contributions, particularly as the United States is stepping back. And so I think there are some trends that are sort of pushing together on this issue, which might be able to bring China's increasing economic strength to bear in funding a lot of these critical agencies of the United Nations. But the truth is, that's not the kind of leadership that it foresees. It's not what it likes. In its history of interactions with a lot of emerging economies, it has been focused on bilateral, on complete projects. That's the term that they use a lot of times in these white papers on development. Complete projects where China engages bilaterally with different countries and then provides everything from the planning to the technicians, the operation. And over time, there's been challenges to this, but it remains sort of a keystone in how China operates globally in a humanitarian way. So there needs to be partnerships that are formed to be able to ask China to step up to the plate. And I do think there's international trends, notably of the United States pushing back, that might encourage it to do so. But that's absolutely right. It's not a hand for help. It's an absolutely critical part of the UN's function.
We are late on schedule, so maybe let's take a very no question. Okay. Very short round of questions, if there are maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience, because we are late on schedule already. So if there are 1 or 2 very short questions for the panelists. Nope. There's a Peter, so I can't see anything.
Yes, thank you. If I may, I'm just wondering if you can define a goal to China's foreign policy globally. Or is China mostly trying to just secure its own supply chain, secure its own resilience, make sure its domestic economy can keep going? Or does it have a goal of influence? Does it have a goal of changing the world order, since we see that its initiatives don't really propose alternatives, as you might have mentioned? Thank you.
So can somebody answer in 30 seconds?
Global initiative, to me, it's once again, it's like a proposal, and when you speak to Chinese interlocutors, they tell you, well, you're welcome, and this is a great project, you should join it. In terms of content, in terms of what are really the boundaries, what exactly it consists in, it's always a work in progress. So it's very hard to, well, it's not hard to see where it tends to, but the way it's defined does not tell you, should I say, doesn't tell you the truth, but does not tell you exactly how the goal will be reached. And that's always the ambiguity with all those initiatives. Of course, they look like they are very open, very welcoming, and the fact that they look like this is because, as I said, there are some limitations, should I say, in conceptualization by China, but it's also, should I say, a trap. It's the both sides of the situation.
So just for you to know, online there were 3 questions, one on China, clean tech, Europe. Basically, how much does EU rely on the clean tech? So we're not going to answer. And then just for you to know, one on the 15th five-year plan. That will be important, so we expect people to analyze it to get some feedbacks. And the last one is on China expertise and how to link it with the institutional demand. Once again, don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, my email address is working, so reach out to me. Reach out to every people in the Commission, in your member states. That's very important. Don't expect always the political leadership to reach out to you. They won't, because they don't have time, and they have too many stuff on the agenda, to put it very, very clearly. So it's not a lack of interest, it's a lack of time and a lack of energy. So don't hesitate yourself to reach out, to send your paper, to send your recommendation, etc. And we need to create an ecosystem that is working way more in Europe, not to copy what's going on in the US, but if there is one thing that is interesting in the US, is that when there is something going on, they reach out to the experts. Because there are more people, because it's easier to reach out, because they have network, etc. We don't have such things in the Europe. So we need to build it up and make sure that through at least informal processes at the beginning, we can get the expertise from the civil society, from all of you, and then inject it into the political machine.
Thank you very much. Then round of applause, please, for the panel. Kjell Erik, would you want to come to the front? Kjeld-Erik, you come to the front. We have Mikko online and we have Kjeld-Erik, the coordinator of the project, for a round of conclusions.
Please go ahead, Nico. Please go ahead.
All right, colleagues, I hope you can hear me. Okay, excellent. Let me make this very brief. I think it's obvious based on this conference, but to everyone who's working on China, that the frequency and consequentiality of China-related decisions is rising rapidly across all domains of policymaking. China's decisions have not just more impact on the future of our prosperity, competitiveness, resilience, the democracy in Europe than ever, but also they have more impact than maybe many domestic policy decisions that Europeans might be contemplating these days. We're seeing an accelerated hegemonic transition. We're seeing the future of the global economic order at stake. We're seeing a rapid trend towards technological decoupling. So the key task of our consortium was really to understand rapid and consequential change in China and China relations. It's a different China that we're meeting today. EU-China relations have been described as being at an inflection point. So the work of, I think, all experts in this consortium will continue to be very relevant moving forward. But it will be extremely challenging. What we generally can know about China is changing. So the conditions for China research have changed pretty dramatically and will probably continue to do so. So what we need, I think, is a good mix of modesty and extremely high ambitions, and then hopefully also actions. On the modesty, I think as researchers, we also have to recognize very often the challenge is not knowledge about China, frankly. It's the political capacity, the will. So the mobilization of expertise may be more important sometimes than the actual knowledge itself. The second point about modesty is I think it's going to be not just a decisive decade for China relations, but also for China experts, because we all will be getting China pretty significantly wrong, despite obviously our ambitions to do the exact opposite. Regarding the ambitions, I'll be very short here. Antoine, you made this point about inserting China knowledge across policy domains. I think that's absolutely central. We need to provide more and better and data-driven research on anything related to China. We need to connect academic think tank work, research, corporate intelligence, public policy making in an ecosystem approach in a more sophisticated way. And we need to seek synergies across hubs of China knowledge in member states and the European Union. So I think we have a big task ahead of us. With a good degree of modesty, we can achieve that, and would like to hand back to Kjeld-Erik. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Nico. It was very well put. I don't have much to add, but I would like to point out that when we started the consortium, when we started the consortium, in the call, there was this notion of independent China research, that it was our main goal, our objective, to establish independent China research. And then you can sort of speculate, independent of what? Of the US or China? But that was what we were supposed to do, and then also create synergies and linkages between researchers and nodes of China knowledge in Europe. And I hope we have contributed to that, because this seen in Europe in terms of China research is that it's very fragmented. You have a lot of smaller research units, centers spread all over Europe, and very few really centers of critical mass. A few, like Merix, but not many. And I hope we have contributed to creating these synergies and linkages between all these various scattered research units all over Europe. And I also hope that we have contributed to put China research, education, knowledge, really on the map. Because in some member states, China studies, China research is being downgraded, and even though we experience here, and I think that is something to take with me back home, is that when we talk to people from the Commission, they really stress the importance of China, the importance of China knowledge, the importance of getting China right, and that needs to be communicated to the member states. So they are also on board that it's really important to strengthen our knowledge concerning China, because they are studying us, and they have strengthened their research, their knowledge of Europe. And then let me also say that it has been a great pleasure working, across Europe in this consortium, with great colleagues from all over Europe, and it has been really a pleasure. And I think, that there are really, good results of this, which will be beneficial to the various member states and our institutions in these member states. And I only hope also that I see some, positive reaction among policymakers. I only hope also our media will react in a positive way, in relation to what we're doing, because we also need to, communicate, disseminate our results to a broader audience. But thanks a lot to Bruegel. Thank you for organizing this terrific event. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Rutger. Thank you for all your preparations. It has been a great pleasure, and I think all members of the consortium agree with me. This has been a success. Thank you very much.